Hey guys, tonight we're going to step through a shimmering portal of time, not into a sun-drenched, chivalric dream, but into the murky, often brutal reality of medieval England. You're walking through a mist-shrouded English forest, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoing faintly. Overhead, the ancient boughs of oak and elm intertwine, casting shadows that seem to stretch and writhe like unseen spirits. You might think you're safe, tucked into your cozy bed, but tonight, we're journeying back to a time when nightmares wore crowns, and history could be far more chilling than any ghost story. Just a heads up, surviving a medieval king's wrath wasn't usually on the to-do list for most common folk. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on the edge of a great, sprawling kingdom, a realm where power wasn't just inherited, but divinely ordained. Back then, a king wasn't merely a political leader. He was God's chosen representative on earth, a living embodiment of justice and order. His word was law, his will absolute, and his very presence was believed to influence the land itself, from the bounty of the harvest to the health of his subjects. A good king was a beacon of hope, a valiant protector, a fount of wisdom and mercy. He was expected to be a mighty warrior, leading his knights into battle, defending his borders, and expanding his dominion. He was also expected to be a shrewd administrator, ensuring justice was meted out, and the royal treasury, while always hungry, wasn't quite starving his subjects into revolt. And, of course, piety was key. A truly great king was seen as devout, respectful of the church, and a patron of holy works. These were the lofty ideals, the shimmering gold threads in the grand tapestry of medieval kingship. But what happens, you might wonder, when the thread isn't gold at all? What if it's a dark, snarled knot, woven with threads of treachery, deceit, and a chilling, almost casual cruelty? Tonight, we're going to pull back the heavy velvet curtain on a reign that didn't just deviate from these ideals, but actively seemed to mock them, leaving behind a legacy so poisoned, so utterly reviled, that its shadow still stretches across centuries. We're talking about a monarch whose name, even now, conjures images of villainy, a king so universally despised by his own people that his very existence seemed to defy the divine right he claimed. Imagine, if you will, the constant, gnawing anxiety that must have permeated every level of society under such a ruler. You're a humble peasant, toiling in the fields, your back aching under the unforgiving sun. Your life is already hard, dictated by the seasons, the whims of your lord, and the ever-present threat of famine or disease. But then, layered on top of all that, is the unpredictable, rapacious nature of the king. His justice isn't fair. It's arbitrary, dispensed not by principle, but by personal pique or the size of a bribe. His taxes aren't just burdensome. They're extortionate, designed to bleed you dry, leaving you with barely enough to survive. And forget about protection. This king might just be the greatest threat to your livelihood, your property, and even your family's safety. It's a bit like having a particularly grumpy, heavily armed landlord who keeps changing the rent on a whim and occasionally tries to repossess your chickens. Pretty sure even the IRS would blush at some of their methods. This wasn't just a king who made unpopular decisions. This was a king whose very character seemed warped, twisted by a profound self-interest that bordered on pathological. Whispers would travel like wildfire through the muddy lanes and bustling market squares, tales of broken promises, of nobles imprisoned without cause, of lands seized on flimsy pretexts. You'd hear hushed stories of how he treated his own family, his closest advisors, anyone who dared to stand in his way. It was a reign defined not by grand victories or wise reforms, but by a pervasive sense of distrust, a creeping dread that seeped into the very foundations of the kingdom. The stain this monarch left on England's medieval tapestry wasn't a small, easily overlooked smudge. It was a gaping, festering wound, a dark thread that snagged and tore at the fabric of royal authority itself. While every king, Even the most beloved faced challenges and critics. This particular ruler managed to unite almost every segment of society against him. His barons, his churchmen, and even the common folk. His name became a byword for treachery, a synonym for cruelty, a cautionary tale whispered in nurseries to frighten unruly children. Be good, a mother might say, or the king will take you away. And for once, the threat felt chillingly real. One mainstream historical fact from this period is that medieval kings, despite their claims to divine right, were always operating within a complex web of feudal obligations and customary laws. They couldn't simply do anything they wanted without consequence. They relied on the loyalty of their barons, the support of the church, and at least the grudging acceptance of their populace. A king was supposed to be God's anointed, yes, but also a shepherd to his flock, a fount of justice, and a valiant protector of his realm. This king, however, seemed to defy all those expectations, eroding the very trust that underpinned the feudal system. Now, for a quirky tidbit. In medieval thought, a king's moral character was often believed to have a direct, almost magical, impact on the natural world. If a king was just and pious, the crops would flourish, the livestock would be healthy, and the weather would be clement. But if a king was wicked and tyrannical, the land itself would suffer. There would be blight on the fields, disease among the animals, and strange, unsettling weather patterns. People believed that the very air became heavy, the sky perpetually overcast, reflecting the darkness in the monarch's soul. So, when this particular king's reign was plagued by disasters, poor harvests, widespread sickness, military defeats, many saw it not just as bad luck, but as divine judgment for his profound unworthiness. It was as if the kingdom itself was physically recoiling from his touch, a living testament to his pervasive dark shadow. You'd almost expect the royal garden to spontaneously grow only weeds shaped like scowling faces. This king's infamy wasn't fleeting. It was deeply ingrained. Even centuries later, his name would continue to evoke a visceral reaction, a shiver of distaste. He was the villain in countless stories, the antagonist in plays, his character serving as the archetype of royal malfeasance. Historians still argue whether his terrible reputation was entirely deserved or exaggerated by later chroniclers and political propaganda. But what's undeniable is the sheer force of the negative image he projected and the lasting mark it left. You see, court life back then was less about Instagram-worthy outfits and more about who could out-schemed whom, usually while wearing enough velvet to carpet a small castle. But even in a world of political intrigue and sharp elbows, this king managed to stand out, not for his brilliance or his virtue, but for his cunning and his vices. He was a master of treachery, capable of betraying allies, family, and even his own solemn oaths with astonishing ease. His cruelty wasn't always a roaring fire, but sometimes a cold, calculating indifference, a willingness to inflict suffering for personal gain or simply to assert dominance. It was this chilling combination of deceit and callousness that cemented his place in the annals of infamy. His reign became a stark warning, a grim lesson in how absolute power, when wielded by a truly terrible individual, can bring a mighty kingdom to its knees. He wasn't just a bad king. He was the bad king, the benchmark against which all future royal failures would be measured. Tonight, we begin to explore the life of this monarch, delving into the darkness that he cast, a shadow that stretched far beyond his own lifetime, leaving an indelible stain on the very soul of medieval England. Word count: 1538. Each awaiting continue. You've just glimpsed the chilling shadow cast by a king whose name became synonymous with treachery and cruelty. A monarch so reviled he left an indelible stain on England's medieval tapestry. But who was this shadowy figure? What forged such a dark reputation? Tonight, we peel back the layers to reveal the man behind the infamy, the one and only John, King of England. Born on Christmas Eve in 1166, John entered the world as the youngest surviving son of one of history's most formidable power couples. Henry II, the Plantagenet king who ruled an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, and Eleanor of Aquitaine, a queen of immense intellect, political savvy, and legendary spirit. Imagine growing up in that household. It was less like a cozy family home and more like a perpetually tense, high-stakes reality TV show where the prize was a kingdom, and sibling rivalry often involved actual warfare. John was the 8th child, the last of his parents' 5 sons. And therein lay his first, defining problem. His older brothers, William, Henry the young king, Geoffrey, and the mighty Richard, had all been granted lands, titles, and prospects. William died young, but the others were set. Henry II, ever the astute but sometimes neglected father, had carved up parts of his vast Angevin Empire for his elder boys. But when John came along, there wasn't much left to give. He was, quite literally, Lackland, a nickname that would stick to him like mud on a medieval boot. You can almost hear the playground taunts in the royal nursery. Richard's got Aquitaine, Geoffrey's got Brittany, and John's got, well, nothing. It must have been a crushing blow to a young man growing up in a world where land equaled power, and power equaled everything. It's like being the last kid picked for the dodgeball team, except the ball is a crown and the game is for keeps. This early lack of inheritance, this perpetual feeling of being overlooked and undervalued, began to fester. While his brothers were out proving their mettle in tournaments and skirmishes, John was often kept closer to his father, perhaps a bit indulged, perhaps a bit ignored in the grand scheme of things. But beneath that seemingly innocuous veneer, a sharp, calculating mind was beginning to form, one that observed the intricate dance of power, ambition, and betrayal that was the daily bread of the Angevin court. His early career, even before he became king, was a masterclass in political opportunism and backstabbing. You see him, still a young man, navigating the treacherous waters of his family's relentless internal squabbles. Henry II, a powerful but deeply flawed ruler, was constantly battling his own sons, who were perpetually eager to usurp his authority or at least grab a bigger slice of the pie. John, despite being his father's favorite for a time, proved to be no exception to the family tradition of filial disloyalty. He participated in the various rebellions against his aging father, a betrayal that reportedly broke Henry II's heart and contributed to his death in 1189. Imagine the shock and despair of a father discovering his most favored son, the one he had tried to protect and provide for, had turned against him in his final days. It paints a pretty grim picture of John's character even then. With Henry II gone, the throne passed to the most formidable of his surviving sons, Richard I, famously known as Richard the Lionheart. And if you thought John had issues with being overshadowed before, imagine how he felt now. Richard was the quintessential medieval hero. Tall, handsome, charismatic, a brilliant military commander, and a celebrated crusader. He was the rock star of the 12th century, the kind of king whose legend was spun even before he'd finished his first campaign. John, by contrast, was of slighter build, less charismatic, and, crucially, less experienced in the arts of war. While Richard was off on the Third Crusade, fighting epic battles in the Holy Land and charming everyone who met him, except maybe the guy whose head he just lopped off, John was back home, doing what he did best: scheming. You watch as he tries to seize power, attempting to undermine his brother's regents and even conspiring with England's greatest enemy, Philip II of France. Richard, hearing of John's antics while he was imprisoned in Austria, a whole other story for another day, involving a very expensive ransom and a lot of political maneuvering, famously remarked that John was not a man to whom one could give a kingdom. It was a classic case of sibling rivalry, except instead of fighting over the last slice of pizza, they were fighting over, well, pretty much all of Western Europe. John's attempts to usurp the throne while Richard was away were audacious, treacherous, and ultimately unsuccessful. He even tried to bribe Philip of France to keep Richard imprisoned, a move that solidified his reputation for disloyalty and utter lack of scruples. When Richard finally returned to England in 1194, freed by the massive ransom paid by his loyal subjects, John found himself in a rather precarious position. His brother, the hero, was back, and John had very little to show for his years of conniving beyond a mountain of debt and a kingdom full of people who now openly distrusted him. Yet, in a testament to Richard's perhaps surprising magnanimity, or perhaps his shrewd political pragmatism, he forgave John. He even named him his heir, a decision that still puzzles some historians, given John's track record. Perhaps Richard understood that John was the only viable alternative to the French king, or maybe he genuinely believed his brother could be reformed. Who knows? It's a bit like forgiving your little brother for trying to sell your prized baseball card collection on eBay while you were away at summer camp. You wouldn't really trust him with your entire savings after that, would you? This early period of John's life is crucial because it established the patterns of behavior that would define his reign. You see the ambition, yes, but also the impatience, the lack of foresight, and the willingness to betray anyone, even his own family, to get what he wanted. He learned that promises were fluid, alliances were temporary, and loyalty was a commodity to be bought and sold. It was a harsh, cynical lesson, and John learned it well. One quirky tidbit about John's upbringing is that despite his later reputation for being somewhat uncultured, he received a surprisingly good education. His tutor, a man named Ranulph of Glanville, was a prominent legal scholar and royal administrator, suggesting that Henry II intended John for a role in governance, perhaps even the church, given his Lackland status. He was reportedly literate, fluent in French and Latin, and had a keen interest in administrative detail, which would later manifest in his somewhat innovative and oppressive methods of taxation. So he wasn't just a brute, he was a smart brute, which arguably made him even more dangerous. Historians still argue whether John's treachery was a result of inherent malice or a desperate scramble for power in a ruthless political landscape. Was he born bad, or did the cutthroat environment of the Angevin court, combined with his initial lack of prospects, mold him into the conniving figure he became? Some argue that he was simply a product of his time, where loyalty was a scarce commodity and ambition often trumped kinship. Others contend that his actions went beyond mere political maneuvering, revealing a deeper character flaw, a profound lack of empathy, and an almost pathological disregard for trust. You can almost hear the medieval chroniclers sharpening their quills, ready to immortalize his villainy. So, by the time Richard the Lionheart died in 1199, struck by a crossbow bolt during a siege, a rather inglorious end for such a legendary warrior, John was finally poised to seize the throne he had so long coveted. He was no longer Lackland, but a man who had clawed his way to the top, leaving a trail of broken promises and betrayed kin in his wake. He had learned the dark arts of medieval statecraft, not through virtuous leadership, but through cunning, opportunism, and a chilling willingness to do whatever it took. You can feel the shift in the air, the subtle but palpable change from the heroic era of Richard to the murky, uncertain dawn of John's reign. The stage is set for a truly terrible kingship, built on the foundations of a youth steeped in deceit and a character forged in the fires of ambition. Section 2. Alright, settle in a little deeper now because we're about to rewind the clock even further, past the crown and the chaos, right back to where it all began for our notorious monarch. You see him, not yet the king, but a prince, a very particular kind of prince, one who arrived quite late to the party. Imagine a sprawling, boisterous medieval family, overflowing with strong personalities and even stronger ambitions. That's the Plantagenet dynasty for you, and into this whirlwind, on Christmas Eve of 1166, pops a baby boy, John. He was the 8th and youngest son of King Henry II and the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine. Now, in a family where lands and titles were divvied up like slices of a very rich, very contested pie, being the youngest was, well, a bit of a raw deal. His older brothers, Henry the young king, Richard, yes, that Richard, the Lionheart, Geoffrey, and a few others who didn't make it to adulthood, had already claimed the prime cuts of the family's vast Anglo-French empire. So, by the time little John arrived, there wasn't much left for him. This is why, very early on, he earned the rather unfortunate, yet entirely fitting nickname, Lackland. You can almost hear the playground taunts, can't you? John Lackland. Got no land. It's a bit like being the kid who always got the hand-me-down toys, but then tried to sell them back to his older brothers. This mainstream historical fact, his very moniker, whispers volumes about his early life and perhaps the deep-seated insecurities that would later fester into a monarchical nightmare. Picture him as a child, growing up in the shadow of giants. His father, Henry II, was a whirlwind of energy, a legal reformer, and a military strategist who practically invented the concept of busy. His mother, Eleanor, was a queen of legendary intellect and political savvy, a woman who'd been Queen of France before she was Queen of England, and who could probably outnegotiate anyone in a room. And then there were his brothers. Henry the young king, charming but feckless. Geoffrey, intelligent but notoriously devious. And Richard, the very embodiment of chivalry and martial prowess, already destined for legend. You can almost feel the weight of expectation, or rather, the lack of it, pressing down on young John. While his older brothers were being groomed for dukedoms and future kingships, learning the art of war and governance, John was, well, he was just John. He was often indulged, perhaps overindulged, by his parents, precisely because he seemed to have so little prospect. This might have instilled in him a sense of entitlement, a belief that what he wanted, he should simply have, regardless of the means. His early education, though, was not entirely neglected. He was certainly literate, a rarity for many nobles of the time, and he understood the intricacies of law and administration, skills he would later twist to his own tyrannical ends. But unlike Richard, who was steeped in the chivalric codes and the art of war, John's training seems to have been more practical, more focused on the nitty-gritty of governance, perhaps indicating that his parents saw him as more of an administrator than a warrior. Yet, there was always that nagging sense of being overlooked, of being the spare, never the heir, a feeling that gnawed at him. As he grew into manhood, Henry II, ever the pragmatic father, tried to carve out a place for his youngest son. He granted John various estates and castles, and in a significant move, made him Lord of Ireland in 1185. You can almost see the glint in John's eye, a chance to prove himself, to finally have his own domain. But this early foray into governance was, shall we say, less than stellar. John, then a young man of 18, arrived in Ireland with a retinue of arrogant young courtiers. They openly mocked the Irish chieftains, pulling their long beards, a grave insult in Irish culture, and generally behaving as if they were on a boisterous lad's holiday rather than a diplomatic mission. The Irish, understandably, were not amused. The result was a quick and brutal rebellion, forcing John to scurry back to England with his tail between his legs after just 8 months. It's like sending your least charming friend to a diplomatic dinner and expecting him to win hearts. Spoiler alert, he didn't. This quirky historical tidbit perfectly illustrates John's early lack of judgment and his penchant for alienating people, a trait that would plague his entire life. Throughout his youth, John was constantly entangled in the complex web of Plantagenet family drama. His older brothers, driven by a desire for more power and often encouraged by their mother, Eleanor, were perpetually rebelling against their father, Henry II. These were not polite disagreements. These were full-blown wars, with castles besieged and armies clashing. John, being the youngest and initially having the least to gain, often remained on his father's side. But as his older brothers began to die off, Henry the young king in 1183, then Geoffrey in 1186, John suddenly found himself much closer to the throne. The stakes were rising, and so too was his ambition. When Henry II finally died in 1189, exhausted by the endless rebellions of his sons, it was Richard, the Lionheart, who inherited the crown. Richard, the Crusader, the warrior king, was immensely popular, a hero of his age. And John? Well, John was still John, still in the shadow. But with Richard preparing for the Third Crusade, John saw his golden opportunity. Imagine the scene. Richard, the embodiment of chivalry, is preparing to embark on a holy war, leaving his kingdom in the hands of regents. And John, ever the opportunist, immediately begins to scheme. He enters into a secret alliance with Richard's greatest rival, Philip II of France, a man whose entire foreign policy seemed to revolve around making the Plantagenets' lives miserable. While Richard was off fighting Saladin, enduring the scorching sun of the Holy Land, John was back home, stirring up trouble. He spread rumors that Richard had died, or that he'd been captured and would never return. He tried to bribe sheriffs, seize royal castles, and generally undermine the authority of the regents Richard had left in charge. It was a brazen, cynical power grab, a betrayal of his own brother and king. You can almost hear the whispers in the smoky halls of the castles. Prince John is making moves. He's trying to take the throne. Many nobles, however, remained loyal to Richard, chief among them the legendary William Marshal, a paragon of knightly virtue who steadfastly defended Richard's interests against John's machinations. Then came the shocking news. Richard had been captured on his way home from the crusade by Leopold V, Duke of Austria, and then handed over to the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI, who demanded an enormous ransom. John, instead of being heartbroken, saw this as his moment to shine, or rather, to seize. He offered the emperor a hefty sum to keep Richard imprisoned longer. He tried to convince the English barons that Richard was never coming back, urging them to declare him king. He even tried to raise an army to invade England himself with French support. This was not just sibling rivalry. It was high treason, a calculated move to usurp the crown. But Richard, against all odds, was eventually ransomed. The English people, loyal to their Lionheart king, rallied to raise the enormous sum. When Richard finally returned to England in 1194, after years of absence and captivity, the kingdom breathed a collective sigh of relief. And John? He was utterly exposed. His schemes had failed, his treachery laid bare. You can almost feel the dread wash over him as he prepares to face his formidable brother. It was a moment of profound humiliation. When they finally met, John fell to his knees, begging for forgiveness. And here's where Richard, the legendary warrior, showed a surprising degree of magnanimity, perhaps urged by their mother, Eleanor, who, despite her own complex relationship with her sons, always tried to hold the family together. Richard famously said, "Do not be afraid, John. You are a child and have done childish things." He forgave him, though he did strip him of some of his lands and offices. Richard basically gave him a TSK, go to your room kind of punishment, which by medieval standards was practically a spa day. This act of forgiveness, while seemingly generous, also subtly underlined John's perceived immaturity and lack of genuine threat in Richard's eyes. It was a public shaming, a declaration that John was not yet, and perhaps never would be, truly worthy of the throne. Historians still argue whether John's early treachery was purely opportunistic or if it stemmed from a genuine belief that he was more capable of ruling than Richard. Was it a desperate bid for power from a man who felt perpetually overlooked, or was it a cold, calculated move by someone who saw an opening and took it, regardless of the ethical cost? Perhaps it was a potent mix of both, fueled by his deep-seated insecurities and a ruthless ambition that would define his future reign. For the next few years, John remained relatively quiet, seemingly chastened, serving his brother. He even fought alongside Richard in France, participating in sieges and proving himself a competent, if not brilliant, military commander. It seemed, for a brief period, that John had learned his lesson, that he had accepted his place. But the leopard, as they say, rarely changes its spots. The ambition, the ruthlessness, the lack of moral compass that had defined his early career were merely dormant, waiting for the right moment to reemerge. And that moment, chillingly, was just around the corner. Because in April of 1199, while besieging the small, seemingly insignificant castle of Calas-Chabrol in Limousin, Richard the Lionheart was struck by a crossbow bolt. The wound festered, and soon the legendary king was dead. The path to the throne was now wide open for John, but not without a very significant obstacle. An obstacle with a name, Arthur of Brittany. Section 3. You find yourself drifting now, not through the gentle mists of a dream, but through the murkier, more unsettling currents of medieval power. We left King John, fresh on the throne, his crown still settling a little awkwardly. But even as he adjusted his royal headgear, a shadow loomed, not from a foreign foe, but from within his own family tree. Cast your mind back to the late 12th century, a time when family reunions could turn into battlefields faster than you could say, succession crisis. And John, bless his heart, was never one for conventional family values. His problem, you see, was a young man named Arthur. Not King Arthur of legend, mind you, but Arthur of Brittany, the son of John's older brother, Geoffrey. Now Geoffrey, alas, had passed away years earlier, trampled by a horse in a jousting accident. A rather dramatic way to exit the family drama, wouldn't you agree? But Geoffrey had left behind this son, Arthur, who, by the rules of primogeniture, the idea that the eldest son or his line inherits, had a perfectly legitimate, if inconvenient, claim to the English throne. Imagine a modern-day corporate takeover, but instead of lawsuits and boardroom battles, you're dealing with swords and castles. It makes the office politics you encounter feel positively quaint, doesn't it? Arthur wasn't just some distant cousin you only saw at Christmas. He was a real, living, breathing alternative to John. And crucially, he was backed by King Philip II of France, a monarch who, much like a cat perpetually eyeing a canary, loved nothing more than to stir up trouble for the English crown. Philip saw Arthur as a perfect puppet, a way to weaken England's grip on its continental possessions. So, while John was busy trying to convince everyone he was the rightful king, Arthur was out there, a teenage prince, slowly gathering support, a visible, breathing threat to John's newly acquired authority. You can almost feel the prickle of paranoia under John's skin. Can't you? The whispers carried on the wind, the subtle shifts in loyalty, the constant nagging fear that someone, somewhere, was plotting to snatch away his shiny new toy, the Kingdom of England. The tension simmered, bubbling beneath the surface like a poorly vented pressure cooker, until it finally erupted in the summer of 1202. Arthur, emboldened by Philip's support, decided to launch an attack on Mirbeau, a strategic castle in Poitou where his formidable grandmother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, John's mother, was residing. Now, Eleanor was a force of nature, a queen who'd seen more political intrigue than most Netflix series combined. She sent a desperate message to John, who, for once, acted with surprising speed and decisiveness. You might even say he pulled off a tactical masterstroke, a moment of unexpected brilliance in a reign that would largely be defined by its blunders. It was like John finally remembered he had a job to do, and for a fleeting moment he actually aced the pop quiz. John, summoning his forces, rode non-stop, covering an astonishing distance in a short amount of time. He arrived at Mirbeau, catching Arthur's forces completely by surprise. Imagine the scene. The clatter of hooves on the dusty ground, the glint of sunlight on armor, the sudden, terrifying realization for Arthur's besiegers that they were now the ones being besieged. John's attack was swift and brutal. Arthur and his key supporters, including the notorious Lusignan family, who were constantly switching allegiances like medieval fashion trends, were captured. This was a massive victory for John, a moment where he truly seemed to assert his dominance. He had caught his rival, his nephew, and the various rebellious barons who supported him. It was a clean sweep, a perfect execution of a military maneuver. But what do you do with a captured rival prince, especially one with a legitimate claim to your throne? This is where John's dark reputation truly began to solidify, thickening like treacle in a cold pot. Arthur was first imprisoned at Falaise Castle in Normandy, a formidable fortress whose stone walls still stand today, bearing silent witness to centuries of history. Picture the damp, cold confines, the distant clang of metal, the smell of stale air and fear. It was here, in the grim silence of Falaise, that John reportedly gave a chilling order to Hubert de Burgh, a loyal and capable baron who was in charge of Arthur's custody. The command was to blind and castrate the young prince. Yes, you heard that right. It was a common, if barbaric, way to render a royal rival incapable of ruling or producing heirs, effectively removing them from the succession without outright killing them. You see, medieval problem-solving wasn't big on HR departments or peaceful negotiations. Hubert de Burgh, however, hesitated. Perhaps he was genuinely appalled, or perhaps he foresaw the political fallout of such an act. The mainstream historical fact is that Hubert did not carry out the order. Instead, he spread rumors that Arthur had died of natural causes and even went so far as to arrange a mock funeral. Imagine the whispers, the hushed conversations among the castle guards, the fearful glances. This quirky tidbit, the idea of a fake funeral for a prince who might still be alive, is a testament to the desperate measures taken to control the narrative in a world without social media. For a time, it seemed to calm the local populace, but the truth, or at least the suspicion, had a way of seeping through the cracks in the stone walls. But Arthur wasn't dead. Not yet. John, perhaps sensing Hubert's reluctance, or simply wanting to keep his inconvenient nephew closer, had Arthur transferred to Rouen, the capital of Normandy, where John himself was frequently present. This move marked a turning point, a shift from the hands of a subordinate to the direct, watchful eye of the king himself. The atmosphere around Arthur would have grown palpably colder, more claustrophobic. You can almost feel the dread seeping into the very stone of his new prison cell, the air growing heavier with unspoken threats. And then Arthur vanished. The exact circumstances of Arthur's disappearance are shrouded in the kind of chilling mystery that makes for excellent campfire stories, or, in our case, bedtime history. But the most infamous account, the one that cemented John's reputation as a ruthless monster, points directly to the king. It was April 1203. The story goes that John, in a fit of rage or calculated cruelty, personally murdered his nephew. Picture the scene, if you dare, through the dim light of history's lens. A moonless night in Rouen, the air thick with the smell of the Seine River. A small boat, perhaps, gliding silently on the dark water. On board, King John himself, and his young, terrified nephew, Arthur. Imagine the silence, broken only by the gentle lapping of the water against the hull, the creak of the oars. No witnesses, no grand declarations, just the chilling presence of a king and his rival. The whispers of chroniclers, writing years later, suggest John stabbed Arthur, perhaps in a drunken rage, or perhaps with cold, calculating intent. Then, so the story goes, he tied a heavy stone to Arthur's body and, with a final sickening splash, threw him into the river. The silence that followed would have been absolute, profound, broken only by the continued gentle lapping of the water, now undisturbed by the presence of a living soul. It was John's idea of a family outing, a macabre, irreversible solution to his succession problem. Of course, no body was ever found. And in the absence of a body, rumors, like weeds, grew rampant and wild. Some suggested Arthur was still alive, hidden away. Others spoke of him being starved to death. But the most persistent and damning accounts, the ones that resonated through the ages, implicated John directly. One such account came from William de Braos, a baron who had once been a close confidant of John's. De Braos, who later fell out spectacularly with the king, a common occurrence, as you'll discover, claimed that John himself confessed to him the murder of Arthur. This testimony, while self-serving given de Braos' later conflict with John, added a powerful, if murky, detail to the narrative. And this is where historians still argue whether King John personally committed the act, or if it was carried out by his agents under direct command, or even if Arthur died in some other, less direct way. The lack of definitive proof leaves room for debate, but the overwhelming consensus, supported by the subsequent actions and reputation of John, leans heavily towards his culpability. The fact remains, Arthur vanished, and everyone knew John was responsible. There were no cell phones, no social media, no instant news alerts, but word of Arthur's disappearance, and John's alleged role in it, spread like wildfire across England and continental Europe. It cemented in the minds of his subjects, and indeed in the minds of his enemies, that John was not just a difficult ruler, but a brutal, ruthless, and utterly untrustworthy man, even to his own kin. This act, this dark stain on John's reign, had immediate and far-reaching consequences. It completely alienated the barons of Brittany and Anjou, who had supported Arthur. They, along with King Philip II of France, now had undeniable proof of John's monstrous character. It gave Philip the perfect pretext to declare John an unworthy vassal and to launch a full-scale invasion of John's remaining French territories. John's performance review from his subjects and his European peers was, shall we say, not going well. The disappearance of Arthur was not just a terrible act of violence. It was a catastrophic political blunder that would haunt John for the rest of his life and beyond, forever marking him as the king who murdered his own nephew. The shadow of Arthur's fate would stretch long and dark over John's reign, a constant reminder of his capacity for cruelty, poisoning his relationships with his subjects and paving the way for the tumultuous years that lay ahead. Section 4. You settle deeper into your pillow, the soft fabric a gentle cradle as we journey back to a time when kings were, for better or worse, the ultimate reality TV stars of their day. We've seen John's early machinations, his unshakable ambition, and the whispers that followed Arthur of Brittany's disappearance like a persistent, unwelcome shadow. Now, prepare yourself for a chapter where the whispers turn into shouts of derision, where John's crown begins to feel less like a majestic symbol and more like a heavy, ill-fitting hat. Because, dear listener, this is where King John, the man who would be known as Lackland even after gaining a kingdom, truly lived up to his unofficial nickname. You see, for centuries, the English monarchy wasn't just about England. Oh no. Thanks to a clever little marriage way back when, between Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, the Plantagenet kings found themselves ruling a vast, sprawling empire that stretched across France. Picture it. Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, Poitou, Aquitaine, a veritable buffet of rich, fertile lands, all under the English crown. For generations, these continental possessions were the very bedrock of English royal power, prestige, and, let's be honest, a good chunk of their income. They were the family jewels, the ancestral lands, the places where many English kings felt more at home than in England itself. But then came John. The stage was set for a dramatic showdown, a clash of titans not unlike two rival coffee shop owners battling for the morning rush, except with swords and sieges instead of artisanal lattes. On one side, you had John, newly crowned, struggling to consolidate his power and shake off the stench of suspicion. On the other, you had Philip II Augustus, the King of France. Philip was no slouch. He was shrewd, patient, and utterly ruthless, the kind of rival who'd not only beat you at chess but then buy the chessboard and sell it back to you at a profit. He'd been chipping away at the Angevin Empire for years, a persistent little woodpecker against a mighty oak. And now, with John on the throne, Philip smelled blood in the water. You can almost feel the damp chill of a medieval castle keep as John receives reports from his Norman strongholds. The news is rarely good. Philip Augustus, with the cunning of a fox and the patience of a saint, well, a very unsaintly saint, began to systematically dismantle John's continental power base. The loss of Arthur of Brittany, John's nephew and rival, wasn't just a moral stain. It was a political blunder of epic proportions. Many French nobles, who might have otherwise stayed loyal to John, were horrified. They saw his actions as a betrayal of feudal law, a king who had crossed a line. And Philip, ever the opportunist, was quick to exploit this disgust. He summoned John to his court to answer for Arthur's disappearance. John predictably refused. Big mistake. Huge. This gave Philip the perfect excuse. In 1202, a French court declared John to have forfeited all his lands in France. Imagine someone declaring you've forfeited your house, your car, and your entire Netflix subscription simply because you didn't show up to court. That's essentially what happened, legally speaking, in the medieval sense. Of course, the declaration was one thing, actually taking the lands was another. But Philip was more than up to the task. He began his systematic conquest, province by province, castle by castle. You can almost hear the rhythmic thud of siege engines, the shouts of men, the desperate cries from behind crumbling walls. John, meanwhile, seemed to embody a strange combination of inaction and impulsive, ill-timed counterattacks. He would sometimes rush across the channel with great fanfare, only to squander his resources or retreat at the first sign of real trouble. It was almost as if he'd packed his bags for a grand adventure, only to realize he'd forgotten his sword and his courage back home. One of the most significant losses, a mainstream historical fact that still sends shivers down the spines of Anglo-French historians, was the fall of Chateau Gallard. This magnificent fortress, built by Richard the Lionheart, was considered virtually impregnable. It stood guard over the River Seine, a symbol of Angevin power in Normandy. Yet, Philip laid siege to it in September 1203. For months, the garrison held out bravely. You can almost taste the desperation in the stale air, the gnawing hunger, the constant threat of collapse. But Philip was relentless. He employed ingenious tactics, even managing to tunnel under the castle walls. When it finally fell in March 1204, it was a devastating blow not just militarily, but psychologically. It was like watching your favorite sports team lose the championship game in overtime, after being up by a mile. The fortress, once thought unconquerable, had fallen, and with it, a significant piece of John's confidence. After Chateau Gallard, the dominoes began to fall rapidly. Rouen, the capital of Normandy, soon followed. The citizens, seeing the writing on the wall and tired of the constant sieges and the perceived lack of help from their distant king, negotiated their surrender. You can picture the solemn faces, the quiet despair as the French banners replaced the English ones on the city walls. It was a humiliating moment for John. Normandy, the very heartland of his family's continental possessions, the land that gave his Norman ancestors their name, was gone. Just like that. But it didn't stop there. Anjou, Maine, Touraine, all these ancestral lands, where John's forefathers had been born and buried, slipped through his fingers like grains of sand. He became known as Softsword to some, a cruel nickname that mocked his apparent military ineptitude. It's hard to imagine the shame, the profound sense of failure that must have gnawed at him. Imagine inheriting a vast, prosperous family business, only to drive it into the ground within a few years. That was John's reality. Now, you might wonder, why was John so bad at this? Was he truly incompetent, or was Philip just that good? Historians still argue whether John's military failures were due to a fundamental lack of strategic acumen, a chronic shortage of funds, or simply the immense challenge of defending such a vast and disparate empire against a unified and determined foe like Philip Augustus. Perhaps it was a cocktail of all three, a truly potent brew of misfortune and mismanagement. One quirky tidbit about John's approach to these campaigns is his often reported tendency to abandon campaigns prematurely, or to simply sail back to England when things got tough, earning him the sarcastic nickname John Softsword from his exasperated contemporaries. It's said that he would sometimes arrive in France with a grand army, make a few half-hearted attempts at reclaiming territory, and then, seemingly out of nowhere, decide it was time for a vacation back home. You can almost hear his advisors sighing, "Oh, for goodness sake, not again, Your Majesty. We just got here." It was less like a king leading his troops and more like a tourist who booked a guided tour but keeps wandering off to find a better snack. The loss of these lands had profound consequences. Firstly, it drastically reduced the English crown's income. No more French taxes, no more French rents, no more French wine to fill the royal cellars. This financial squeeze would later become a major driver for John's increasingly aggressive and tyrannical taxation of his English subjects, a topic we'll certainly delve into. Secondly, it shifted the focus of the English monarchy firmly back to England. For centuries, kings had juggled two identities, rulers of England and powerful continental princes. Now, they were primarily kings of England, and this forced a reevaluation of their priorities and their relationship with their English subjects. It was like a long-distance relationship finally breaking up, forcing both parties to focus on their immediate surroundings. John made a few attempts to reclaim his lost territories, of course. He wasn't one to simply roll over and play dead, even if he often acted like it. He tried diplomacy, he tried alliances, he even tried another invasion or two. He would often spend vast sums of money, raising armies and equipping fleets, only for his campaigns to sputter out or end in ignominious defeat. It was like watching someone repeatedly trying to kick a very stubborn vending machine, only to end up with a bruised foot and no snacks. His most ambitious attempt came years later in 1214 at the Battle of Bouvines. This was John's big chance, his Avengers, endgame moment, if you will. He formed a grand coalition with the Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV and various counts and dukes, all aimed at crushing Philip Augustus and reclaiming his lost empire. You can imagine the tension, the hopes riding on this one decisive battle. But, alas for John, it ended in spectacular failure. His allies were routed, Otto fled, and John's continental ambitions were shattered beyond repair. It was a truly epic faceplant, leaving him with a mountain of debt and a severely bruised ego. So, by 1214, the vast Angevin Empire in France, painstakingly built over generations, had largely evaporated. All that remained was a sliver of Aquitaine in the southwest. John, the king who inherited so much, had lost almost everything. The shame of this loss, the constant mockery from Philip Augustus, and the immense financial burden of his failed attempts to reclaim his lands, all contributed to his growing unpopularity. He was seen as weak, incompetent, and a failure on the grand stage of European politics. You can almost feel the collective sigh of exasperation from the English barons and common folk alike. Their king, meant to be a beacon of strength and protector of their interests, had instead become a source of national humiliation. The continental dream was over. England was, for the first time in centuries, truly an island kingdom, forced to look inward to its own resources and to its own people. And that, dear listener, set the stage for the next, even more turbulent, chapter in John's reign, where his subjects, pushed to their breaking point, would finally decide they'd had enough. Section 5. You drift now, not through the muddy fields of Normandy, but into the echoing, hallowed halls of England's spiritual heart. Imagine the hushed reverence, the scent of beeswax and old stone, as you stand in Canterbury Cathedral. It's the year 1205, and a seismic shift is about to rock the very foundations of power in England. The venerable Archbishop of Canterbury, Hubert Walter, has just passed away. He was a man of immense influence, a close advisor to kings, and practically a co-ruler at times. His death leaves a gaping void, a power vacuum that King John, ever keen to assert his authority, sees as a prime opportunity. But the church, you see, had its own ideas about succession. The monks of Canterbury, specifically the senior chapter, had the traditional right to elect their new archbishop. It was a sacred duty, a solemn affair, usually conducted with due deliberation and a nod to royal preference. However, in this instance, things got a little messy. You watch as a group of the younger, perhaps more impetuous monks decide to take matters into their own hands. They secretly convene, whispering in the shadows, their breath misting in the cold air of the cathedral. Without informing their senior brethren, and certainly without consulting the king, they hold a clandestine election. Their chosen candidate, a sub-prior named Reginald. Now, Reginald, bless his heart, was apparently sworn to secrecy. He was to travel to Rome, present himself to the Pope, and only then reveal his election. It was a scheme worthy of a medieval spy novel, except, well, it didn't quite work out. Reginald, it turns out, wasn't exactly cut out for secret missions. He got to Flanders, and, perhaps overcome with the thrill of his new, secret status, he started blabbing. News travels fast, even in the Middle Ages, especially when it concerns something as vital as the Archbishopric of Canterbury. Before you can say papal bull, King John hears about this audacious, unsanctioned election. You can almost feel the royal fury emanating from him. John, who considered himself the ultimate authority in his realm, including over the church, was absolutely incandescent. How dare these monks undermine his prerogative? It was like someone trying to appoint a new CEO for your company without even a courtesy call. John, naturally, had his own man in mind for the job. John de Grey, the Bishop of Norwich. De Grey was a loyal royal servant, a man John could trust to do his bidding, and more importantly, a man who wouldn't challenge his authority. So, John exerted his formidable will, forcing the senior monks of Canterbury to hold another election and, surprise, surprise, they elected John de Grey. The king, delighted, promptly invested his chosen candidate with the temporalities of the see, essentially giving him control of the church's lands and revenues. Problem solved, right? Oh, dear listener, if only medieval history were that simple. Because now, both Reginald and John de Grey are making their way to Rome, each presenting their case to the supreme arbiter of Christendom, Pope Innocent III. And this, you quickly learn, is where King John's troubles truly begin to escalate. Imagine Pope Innocent III, not as a frail, kindly old man, but as a towering figure of intellect and ambition. He was a brilliant legal scholar, a master of canon law, and arguably the most powerful pope of the Middle Ages. He believed, with every fiber of his being, in the absolute supremacy of the spiritual power over the temporal. Kings might rule lands, but the Pope ruled souls and, by extension, the entire Christian world. He had already humbled the mighty King Philip II of France and was well on his way to asserting papal authority across Europe. He wasn't just a religious leader, he was a geopolitical force, a spiritual CEO with a global mandate. So, when these two English candidates, Reginald and John de Grey, arrived at his court, each claiming legitimacy, Innocent III saw not just a local dispute, but a golden opportunity to assert papal authority directly over England. He listened patiently to both sides, weighed the arguments, and then, with the decisive stroke of a pen, he annulled both elections. Reginald's election was invalid because it was secret and irregular. John de Grey's election was invalid because it was held under royal duress, and, crucially, because the Pope deemed the Canterbury monks' right of election to be primary, but subject to papal approval in cases of dispute. Then came the bombshell. Pope Innocent III, exercising his supreme authority, decided to appoint his own candidate to the Archbishopric of Canterbury, and his choice was a man named Stephen Langton. Now, who was Stephen Langton? He wasn't some unknown. He was an English cardinal, a renowned scholar, a professor at the University of Paris, and a man of immense learning and integrity. He had studied theology, law, and philosophy, and was respected across Europe. He was also, importantly, a man who believed in the rights of the Church and the spiritual independence of its clergy. The Pope saw in Langton not just a brilliant mind, but a man of principle who would uphold the dignity of the Church. He was, in the Pope's eyes, the ideal candidate to bring order and spiritual rectitude to the English Church. But to King John, Langton was an absolute anathema. You can picture John, pacing his chambers, veins throbbing. This wasn't just about who was archbishop. It was about who decided. The Pope, a foreign power, had dared to impose an archbishop on his kingdom without his consent. It was an outrageous affront to royal dignity, a direct challenge to his God-given right to rule. It was as if your internet service provider suddenly decided to replace your router with one of their choosing, completely ignoring your preferences, and then expected you to pay for it. John's reaction was swift and predictably brutal. He was incandescent with rage. He refused to accept Langton. He declared that anyone who recognized Langton as archbishop would be considered an enemy of the crown. And then, he took direct action against the very heart of the resistance. He seized the lands and revenues of the Canterbury monks, confiscating their property, and expelling them from their monastery. You can imagine the scene. Royal officers, stern-faced, marching into the hallowed precincts, seizing monastic treasures, driving the bewildered monks from their homes. It was a clear, unambiguous message. Defy the king, and you will pay a heavy price. John argued that Langton was a French sympathizer, given his long residence in Paris, a city that was, after all, the capital of England's greatest rival. He also claimed that Langton had never sworn fealty to him, nor had he received his temporalities from the king. It was a matter of royal prerogative, John insisted, an inviolable right of the English crown to approve its own archbishops. The Pope, however, was not a man to back down. Innocent III wrote to John, urging him to accept Langton, explaining his reasons, and reminding the king of his spiritual duties. But John, stubborn as a mule, dug in his heels. He was convinced he was in the right, that his royal authority was being unjustly challenged. He simply refused to budge. He saw the Church, at least the English Church, as an extension of his own royal administration, a source of revenue and patronage. The idea of an independent-minded archbishop, appointed by a foreign power, was intolerable. The clash escalated. Letters flew back and forth across the Channel, each one growing more terse, more threatening. Papal legates were dispatched to England, attempting to mediate, to persuade John to relent. But John remained defiant. He insulted the legates, he threatened them, and he continued to persecute those clergy who showed any sympathy for Langton or the Pope. He was effectively saying, "My kingdom, my rules," and that includes who gets to be the top priest. This wasn't just a squabble over a job. It was a fundamental conflict over sovereignty. Who held ultimate power in England? Was it the king, divinely appointed, ruling by the grace of God? Or was it the Pope, the vicar of Christ on earth, wielding spiritual authority over all Christian monarchs? This was the biggest, most dramatic confrontation of John's reign so far, and it laid bare his deeply autocratic tendencies. He believed he was accountable to no one, certainly not to a man in Rome. You can almost hear the tension crackling in the air, feel the uneasy silence that fell over England as the standoff continued. Every bishop, every priest, every monk, every lord in the land was forced to consider where their loyalties lay, with the king who held their lands and their lives in his hands. or with the Pope, who held the keys to their immortal souls. It was an agonizing choice for many. John, in his hubris, believed he could outmaneuver the Pope. He thought his royal power, his control over the English Church's vast wealth, would be enough to force Innocent III to back down. He was, as you've probably gathered by now, not the best judge of character, especially when that character happened to be one of the most formidable pontiffs in history. Historians still argue whether John's fierce resistance to Langton was primarily a matter of principle over royal prerogative, a calculated move to seize church wealth, or simply another example of his deeply entrenched stubbornness. Perhaps it was a volatile cocktail of all three. What is clear, however, is that this confrontation marked a turning point. John had not just annoyed the Pope. He had directly challenged the very foundation of papal authority. And Innocent III was not a pope who took challenges lightly. He had an arsenal of spiritual weapons at his disposal, and he was not afraid to use them. The stage was set for a spiritual siege on England, a weapon far more devastating than any army. But that, my friend, is a story for later. For now, let the echoes of John's defiant refusal reverberate through the quiet night. Section 6. And so, you find yourself standing on the precipice of a truly grim period in England's history, as King John's defiance of Pope Innocent III reached a terrifying crescendo. The Pope, a man not known for his patience or his willingness to compromise, had warned John. He had pleaded. He had threatened. And when John remained as stubborn as a particularly well-rooted oak tree in a gale, Innocent finally unleashed his most devastating spiritual weapon, the interdict. Imagine, if you will, the year 1208. The crisp air of March still carried the last whispers of winter, but a far colder, more profound chill was about to descend upon the land. One day you wake up, and something feels off. The familiar, comforting clang of the church bells, a constant soundtrack to medieval life, is eerily absent. You step outside, and the usual bustle seems subdued, hushed. People move with a new kind of solemnity, their faces etched with a worry that goes deeper than the usual concerns about crops or taxes. Because, you see, an interdict wasn't just a ban on a few church services. Oh no, my sleepy historian, it was far more pervasive, far more insidious than that. It was, in essence, a spiritual lockdown, a divine boycott of an entire nation. Pope Innocent III, in his holy fury, had declared that as long as King John remained unrepentant, England would be deprived of almost all the sacraments that were the very bedrock of medieval Christian life. Think of it like this. If your smart home suddenly decided to stop talking to your smart devices, no lights, no music, no coffee maker, but instead of just inconvenience, it meant your eternal soul was now on the line. That's the kind of vibe we're going for here. The first thing you'd notice, as you wander through your village or town, is the silence. The church doors, once always open, inviting, are now firmly shut, often locked and sometimes even boarded up. The altars, usually aglow with candles and adorned with flowers, are bare and cold. The holy water stoups are dry. The very air inside the hallowed walls seems to hold its breath, waiting for an absolution that wouldn't come. No joyous hymns echo through the nave. No murmured prayers rise to the heavens. It was so quiet, you could probably hear a knight's armor creak from a mile away, or the collective sigh of 1,000 worried souls. But the silence was just the beginning. The truly devastating impact of the interdict seeped into every single milestone of human existence. Let's start with life itself. A baby is born, a fragile new life. In medieval times, baptism was not merely a ceremony. It was the essential gateway to salvation, cleansing original sin and admitting the child into the Christian community. But under the interdict, public baptisms were forbidden. You might be able to find a priest willing to perform a quick, private, unceremonial baptism, perhaps in the dead of night, whispered and hurried. But the fear lingered. What if the child died before this clandestine ritual? What if their tiny soul was condemned to limbo, or worse, for all eternity, simply because of the king's stubbornness? The anxiety for new parents must have been unbearable. Then there were the unions of love, or at least of strategic alliance. Marriages, usually celebrated with pomp and blessing in the church, were now stripped of their spiritual significance. You could still get married, technically speaking, but it would be a purely secular affair. A contract exchanged perhaps in a barn or a private home, lacking the solemn blessing of God. For a society that believed deeply in the sanctity of marriage as a sacrament, this was profoundly unsettling. Imagine planning your big day, only to be told, "Sorry, darling, the Pope says no holy matrimony until the king apologizes. Maybe you can just shake hands and hope for the best." Not exactly the stuff of fairy tales, is it? And finally, the end of life. This was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the interdict. When someone died, the traditional rites of passage, the last confession, the anointing of the sick, known as extreme unction, the solemn funeral mass, and burial in consecrated ground were all denied. The body of your loved one could not be brought into the church. There would be no tolling of bells, no mournful chant of priests. Instead, the deceased were often interred in unconsecrated ground, perhaps in a ditch by the roadside, or in a field without prayers or blessings. The fear of dying without absolution, of having your soul cast into the torment of hell because you couldn't receive the last rites, was a pervasive and visceral terror. For the devout medieval mind, this was a fate worse than death itself. It was spiritual abandonment. Mainstream historical fact asterisk: the papal interdict on England lasted for over 5 years, from March 1208 until May 1213, making it one of the longest and most comprehensive interdicts in European history. During this time, public church services were indeed suspended, and most sacraments were withheld, creating immense spiritual distress across the kingdom. King John, meanwhile, seemed remarkably unfazed by the spiritual plight of his subjects. While his people grappled with existential dread, he saw the interdict as an opportunity. With the church effectively neutralized, he began to seize its properties, confiscate its revenues, and extort fines from the clergy who dared to defy his will. He was effectively holding the English church hostage, squeezing every penny he could from its lands and assets. It was a classic John move. When in doubt, exploit the situation for financial gain. You could almost hear him thinking, "Less noise on Sundays, more gold for my coffers." Of course, there were a few very limited exceptions to the interdict. Baptism of infants, as mentioned, was often permitted in private, and confession and viaticum, communion for the dying, were sometimes administered, though usually in silence and without ceremony, to prevent souls from being eternally lost. But even these exceptions were often debated and inconsistently applied across different dioceses, adding to the confusion and anxiety. Quirky or fringe tidbit asterisk: one of the more peculiar aspects of the interdict was the specific instruction that bodies were to be buried in unconsecrated ground, often without shrouds or coffins, and sometimes even facing north instead of the traditional east. This was a deliberate symbolic act to emphasize their exclusion from the grace of the church, a grim visual reminder of the kingdom's spiritual exile. Imagine trying to explain that to the undertaker. The years dragged on. 5 long years. Imagine living under that cloud, day in and day out. The constant, gnawing fear for your own soul, for the souls of your children and your parents. The sight of silent churches, the sound of unrung bells, the grim processions to unblessed graves. The spiritual desolation began to manifest in social unrest. People started to question John's legitimacy, his fitness to rule. If God had seemingly abandoned England because of its king, what did that say about the king himself? Open scholarly debate phrase asterisk: historians still argue whether the widespread fear of damnation was truly universal among the populace, or if some found ways to cope, perhaps through folk traditions or quiet defiance, and how effectively the interdict was enforced in every remote corner of the kingdom. Some scholars suggest that while the official ban was absolute, local priests and communities may have found ways to discreetly offer some solace, bending the rules where possible, especially in areas far from direct royal or papal oversight. Life under the interdict wasn't just about the spiritual void. It was also about the psychological toll. The very fabric of society, woven with threads of faith and communal rituals, began to fray. Without the regular gathering at Mass, without the shared experience of worship, the sense of community diminished. What was a medieval person to do for entertainment or social interaction when the main public gathering spot was closed, and even the gossip after Mass was no longer an option? Perhaps they resorted to more storytelling, or just staring at walls, contemplating their eternal fate. It wasn't exactly a party. This sustained period of spiritual hardship, coupled with John's relentless financial exploitation of the church, did little to endear him to his people or to the clergy. The blame for this widespread suffering, this divine punishment, was laid squarely at the king's feet. Every silent bell, every unblessed grave, every unbaptized child became a testament to John's tyranny and his sacrilegious defiance. The stage was being set for a confrontation, not just with the Pope, but with his own increasingly desperate and disillusioned subjects. The patience of the English people, like a tightly stretched bowstring, was nearing its breaking point. Section 7. You find yourself standing on the precipice of a decision, a moment that will forever etch itself into the annals of English history, a moment of profound humiliation for a king who, until now, had prided himself on his defiance. Remember how King John had dared to stand against the mighty Pope Innocent III? How he had refused to accept Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury, leading to England being placed under the chilling shadow of an interdict. For years now, the bells have been silent, the sacraments withheld, the dead unburied in consecrated ground. Imagine the spiritual desolation, the quiet despair that has settled over the land like a thick, suffocating fog. But now the fog is about to lift, though at a price so steep, it will make your jaw drop. John, cornered like a badger in a trap, faces not just the spiritual wrath of the Pope, but the very real, very physical threat of a French invasion. King Philip II of France, ever the opportunist, has been given papal blessing to invade England and depose John, casting him from his throne like an unwanted dog. You can almost hear the clatter of French armor across the channel, the whispers of discontent growing louder among John's own barons, weary of his tyranny and the spiritual starvation of their realm. So, in this pressure cooker of desperation, John does what few would have imagined from a man of his stubborn pride. He folds. He sends envoys, desperate pleas, to the Holy See, and the Pope, ever the shrewd negotiator, responds. He dispatches his nuncio, Pandulph Veraclo, a man whose name sounds like he should be selling exotic spices, but who, in fact, carries the full, terrifying weight of papal authority. You are transported to the quiet, unassuming Templar church at Dover on the 15th of May, 1213. The air is thick with anticipation, heavy with the scent of damp stone and the unspoken anxieties of the few witnesses. John, usually so boisterous, so quick to anger, stands before Pandulph, a figure of contained, brittle tension. His eyes, you notice, dart around, perhaps searching for an escape, perhaps for a hint of pity, but finding none. Pandulph, by contrast, is calm, almost serenely confident. He represents the will of God, or at least the will of God's earthly representative, and that, in this age, is a power beyond kings. The terms of surrender are laid out, stark and unyielding. John must accept Stephen Langton as archbishop. Check. He must compensate the church for all the revenues he seized during the interdict. Ouch, but doable. But then comes the kicker, the truly astonishing demand that makes your breath catch in your throat. John, King of England, must surrender his kingdom, all of it, to the Pope. Not just England, mind you, but also Ireland. He must become the Pope's vassal. Imagine that for a moment. You, the sovereign ruler, kneeling before a foreign representative, offering up your entire realm. It's like surrendering the deed to your house, your car, your pet goldfish, all because your neighbor complained about your loud music. Only, in this case, the neighbor has an army of divine retribution. John, his face a mask of what you can only describe as a mixture of humiliation and grim resolve, agrees. He has no choice. The alternative is deposition, perhaps even death, and the loss of everything he has schemed and fought for. Survival, for John, trumps pride, every single time. And so the ceremony begins. You watch as John kneels, a king brought low, not by an invading army, but by the relentless pressure of spiritual censure and political isolation. He places his crown, the very symbol of his sovereignty, into Pandulph's hands. It's a moment pregnant with meaning, a visual representation of the transfer of power. For 3 long days, or so the story goes, the crown remains in Pandulf's keeping, a stark reminder of who truly holds the upper hand. Historians still argue whether this 3-day retention was a deliberate, drawn-out act of public humiliation orchestrated by Pandulf, or simply a practical delay in the administrative process of documenting the new arrangement. Either way, the message was loud and clear. John was no longer his own master. Then comes the formal act of homage. John, still on his knees, places his hands between Pandulf's, a gesture of feudal submission that would have been familiar to any medieval lord acknowledging his superior. He swears fealty to Pope Innocent III and his successors, acknowledging himself and his heirs as the Pope's liegemen. He pledges that England and Ireland will forever be held as fiefs of the Holy See. And for this unprecedented act of submission, for this transformation of a proud kingdom into a papal possession, there is a price. A yearly tribute, 1,000 marks, 700 for England, 300 for Ireland. This annual payment, known as a census, was a tangible symbol of England's new status as a papal fiefdom. It might not sound like much today, perhaps the equivalent of a particularly expensive coffee habit for an entire nation, but in medieval terms, it was a significant sum and a perpetual reminder of John's abject surrender. It's like paying rent on your own country, except the landlord lives in Rome and has a very big stick. The official charter, meticulously drafted, is then sealed. You can almost hear the wax crackling as the royal seal is pressed, cementing this extraordinary agreement. The document explicitly states that John is acting not compelled by force, but of his own good and spontaneous will, which, let's be honest, is a bit like saying you willingly handed over your wallet to a mugger because you appreciated his persuasive arguments. The whole thing is a masterclass in diplomatic euphemism. What does John gain from this spectacular act of self-abasement? A lot, actually. First and foremost, the interdict is lifted. The churches reopen. The bells ring out across England once more, bringing a collective sigh of relief from a populace starved of spiritual comfort. Baptisms, marriages, burials of the rhythms of life and death, so long disrupted, can resume. Imagine the joy, the quiet tears of gratitude, as people can finally receive the sacraments again. It's a spiritual detox for an entire nation. More pragmatically, John gains the Pope's powerful protection. Remember King Philip II and his invasion plans? Well, now Philip is told, in no uncertain terms, to stand down. England is now a papal fief, and any attack on England is an attack on the Pope's own property. This is a game changer. John, who was on the verge of losing everything, suddenly has the most formidable ally in Europe. It's like calling in the biggest, toughest bouncer at the club to deal with your angry ex. This alliance with the Pope also serves another crucial purpose, one that will become increasingly important in the years to come. It strengthens John's hand against his own increasingly rebellious barons. With the Pope's spiritual and political backing, John is now seen as divinely sanctioned, his position bolstered by the highest authority in Christendom. Any baron who dares to rise against him would not only be committing treason against their king, but also defying the will of the Pope. It's a brilliant, if deeply humiliating, piece of political maneuvering. You might even call it a strategic masterstroke, albeit one painted in shades of deep scarlet shame. The immediate aftermath sees Pandulf departing, taking with him the symbolic victory of the papacy. John, though diminished in the eyes of many, is, for the moment, secure on his throne. The whispers among the people, however, are not of respect, but of bewilderment and contempt. How could their king, the descendant of William the Conqueror, stoop so low? The optics are terrible, a PR nightmare if ever there was one. It's the kind of move that would launch 1,000 memes today, probably involving John photoshopped with a dunce cap. Yet, for John, this was a necessary evil. He had alienated almost everyone. His French subjects, his English barons, the church. His treasury was depleted, his reputation in tatters. By becoming the Pope's man, he bought himself time, legitimacy, and a powerful shield against his enemies, both foreign and domestic. He traded his pride for his crown, and for a king as pragmatic and ruthless as John, that was a bargain he was willing to strike. It's a testament to his survival instinct, a grim determination to cling to power no matter the cost to his dignity or his kingdom's sovereignty. The stage is now set for the next act of this tumultuous reign, but for now, the silence of the interdict has been broken, and the church bells ring out, a sound of relief, yes, but also a mournful peal for a kingdom willingly surrendered. Section 8. You've seen John's cunning, his ruthlessness, and his knack for alienating pretty much everyone, from his own family to the mighty Pope. But now, as you settle deeper into your comfy spot, let's talk about something that hits a little closer to home for most of us. Money. Or, more accurately, how King John took money. Because, after losing almost all of his ancestral lands in France and constantly trying to win them back, not to mention funding a lifestyle that made a modern influencer look frugal, John needed cash. A lot of it. And he wasn't shy about getting it. Imagine, if you will, the collective groan that rippled across England every time the king's tax collectors came knocking. It was less a gentle tap and more a battering ram against your front door. Previous kings had certainly taxed their subjects, but John was a true innovator in the art of financial extraction. He wasn't just collecting. He was inventing new ways to empty your pockets, pushing his subjects to a breaking point that would make even the most patient person wonder if they could perhaps just emigrate to a less financially demanding kingdom. Let's start with one of the big ones, a term that sounds almost medievally quaint now. Scutage. Think of it as shield money. In feudal times, a knight was supposed to provide military service to his lord, or to the king. But what if the knight didn't want to go fight in France or couldn't? Well, he could pay a fee in lieu of service. This was scutage. It was meant to allow the king to hire professional soldiers, which sounds reasonable enough. But John, ever the opportunist, took this concept and ran with it like it was the last slice of cake at a royal feast. He levied scutage a staggering 11 times during his 17-year reign. To put that in perspective, his father, Henry II, a king who also fought many wars, only levied it 7 times in a much longer reign of 34 years. It was less about needing soldiers and more about simply needing money, often demanding it even when there was no immediate campaign. You can almost hear the knights grumbling. Again? I just paid for the last one. Are we sure he needs a new pair of royal slippers that badly? Then there were the feudal incidents, those rather intricate financial obligations tied to land ownership in the medieval system. These were the king's rights over his tenants-in-chief, the great barons and knights who held land directly from him. John exploited every single one with ruthless efficiency. Take wardship, for instance. If a baron died leaving an heir who was still a minor, the king became the guardian of that heir and, crucially, took control of their lands and revenues until the heir came of age. Now, a benevolent king might have managed these lands responsibly. John, however, saw it as a temporary windfall. He'd often strip the estates bare, leaving them depleted and impoverished by the time the young heir finally took possession. It was like borrowing your friend's car and returning it on empty, with the tires flat and a check engine light blinking furiously. And marriage? Oh, the king had a say in that too. If a female heiress was left without a husband, the king had the right to arrange her marriage. Why? To ensure she married someone loyal to the crown, someone who wouldn't pose a threat. But John turned this into a lucrative business. He would sell off heiresses to the highest bidder, often to men they detested, or he would demand exorbitant fines from women who wished to marry someone of their own choosing, or even from those who simply wished not to marry at all. Imagine having to pay the king just for the right to remain single. It's a level of micromanagement that would make even the most demanding boss blush. Then there was relief, the payment made by an heir to the king upon inheriting their land. It was supposed to be a reasonable sum, a recognition of the king's ultimate lordship. John, of course, inflated these sums beyond all custom, making it almost impossible for heirs to take possession of their rightful inheritance without incurring massive debt to the crown. It was as if every time you inherited a family heirloom, the government demanded a percentage of its value, plus an inheritance processing fee, a good luck with that surcharge, and a don't even think about complaining penalty. Beyond the feudal system, John cast his net wide. He levied tallage, a tax on towns and royal domain, lands directly owned by the crown. These were typically fixed sums, But John squeezed every last penny, demanding frequent and heavy payments. The towns, burgeoning centers of trade and wealth, became prime targets for his insatiable appetite for funds. You could almost hear the shopkeepers sighing, "Another royal decree? Is it for more crusades? Or just another one of the king's infamous banquets?" And the forests, the royal forests, protected by strict and often brutal forest law, became another goldmine for John. These laws were already deeply unpopular, restricting commoners from hunting or even gathering wood in vast swathes of land. John intensified the enforcement, levying eye-watering fines for even the most minor infractions: a stray dog, a fallen branch, a rabbit caught accidentally. It was a system designed to catch you out, to ensnare you in a web of petty regulations and then demand a fortune for your release. You'd be walking through the woods, minding your own business, and suddenly a royal forester would pop out from behind a tree, demanding a fine because your shadow fell on a royal oak. But perhaps the most insidious way John raised money was by essentially monetizing justice itself. This wasn't about corruption in the modern sense, where a judge takes a bribe. No, this was far more systematic. People had to pay the king simply to get a court case heard, or to delay one, or even to not have one heard. If you wanted a favor from the king, if you wanted him to intervene on your behalf in a dispute, or if you simply wanted him to listen to your petition, you had to pay. These payments, known as fines for royal favor, were recorded meticulously in the pipe rolls, the royal financial accounts. You might find entries like X shillings for the king to hear my plea, or Y pounds for the king to not pursue this case against me. It was like a medieval pay-to-play system, where access to the judicial system, and even basic fairness, depended entirely on the size of your purse. Imagine having to pay for the judge to even look at your paperwork. And then there's the especially grim chapter of John's financial dealings: his exploitation of England's Jewish community. In medieval England, Jews were often the primary moneylenders, a profession forbidden to Christians by the church. This made them indispensable to the crown, as they could provide large sums of money through loans. However, it also made them vulnerable. They were considered direct property of the king, and John treated them as a private ATM. He would demand immense sums from them, often without warning, and if they couldn't pay, he would resort to brutal methods of extortion, including imprisonment and torture. There's a particularly chilling, albeit somewhat apocryphal, story of a wealthy Jew from Bristol, Abraham, who was held captive and had one tooth pulled out each day until he paid a massive ransom. After 7 days and 7 teeth, he finally relented. While the exact details of this specific account are debated, the historical reality of John's systematic and cruel exploitation of the Jewish community for financial gain is a mainstream historical fact, illustrating the sheer depths of his avarice. It wasn't just taxation. It was state-sanctioned robbery, backed by violence. John's methods weren't just about collecting money. They were about control and punishment. He would fine people for not serving in the army, fine them for not having the right kind of armor, fine them for refusing to marry someone he chose, fine them for pretty much anything he could think of. He even demanded hostages from his barons as surety for their loyalty and their payments. And if the payments weren't made, those hostages could face grim fates. It was a constant, nagging pressure, like a leaky faucet that never stops dripping, slowly but surely emptying your bucket. The cumulative effect of this relentless financial pressure was devastating. For the barons, it meant their feudal obligations, once a predictable if sometimes burdensome part of their lives, became an unpredictable, ruinous drain. Their lands were stripped, their heirs impoverished, their daughters sold off. For the knights and smaller landowners, it meant constant anxiety over fines, scutage, and the arbitrary demands of the king's officials. And for the common people, the townsfolk and peasants, it meant higher prices, less security, and a pervasive sense of injustice. The money that should have been used to improve their lands, to invest in their families, or simply to survive, was instead funneled into John's coffers, funding his ill-fated wars and his increasingly unpopular court. You can almost feel the simmering resentment. It wasn't just the amount of money John took. It was the way he took it. It was arbitrary, often cruel, and seemed to serve no purpose other than to line his own pockets and fuel his military failures. This wasn't taxation for the common good. It was extortion for royal indulgence. The constant demands, the innovative methods, the sheer disregard for custom and fairness. It all added up. Historians still argue whether the severity of John's taxation or his personal untrustworthiness was the primary catalyst for the baronial rebellion. Was it the empty coffers of the barons, or the fact that they simply couldn't stand the man anymore? Perhaps it was a potent cocktail of both, a perfect storm brewing in the hearts and minds of a nobility pushed to their absolute limits. They had had enough. The money, or rather the lack of it in their own hands, coupled with the king's capricious nature, was the final straw. And soon, this simmering resentment would boil over, leading to one of the most famous showdowns in English history. But that, my friends, is a story for another time. For now, just imagine trying to balance your medieval budget under King John. It would have been a nightmare. Section 9. You've seen King John's trajectory, his path paved with strategic blunders, spiritual defiance, and financial innovations that would make a modern-day tax collector blush. But as these actions piled up, one on top of the other, they weren't just abstract events happening to a kingdom. They were directly impacting the powerful, land-owning barons who formed the backbone of England's military and social structure. And let me tell you, if there's one thing a medieval baron loved more than a good feast, it was their feudal rights and their family's land. John, unfortunately for him, seemed determined to trample all over both. Imagine yourself, a proud baron, lord of your own lands, with knights sworn to your service, and a lineage stretching back generations. You've always understood that your fealty to the king comes with certain expectations: protection, justice, and a respect for established customs. But under John, that unspoken contract, that delicate balance of power, felt like it was constantly being rewritten, usually in John's favor, and usually with a very large, expensive pen. You begin to notice the chill wind of arbitrary justice blowing through the land. Perhaps a rival baron, someone John dislikes, suddenly finds their lands seized on a flimsy pretext, or is hit with an exorbitant fine for a minor transgression. Then it's your turn. Maybe John demands an astronomical sum for your son's inheritance, or insists on holding your own children as hostages to ensure your loyalty. A common practice, yes, but John pushed it to an unprecedented level, often taking the children of barons who were already perfectly loyal, just because he could. It's like your king just decided to play a never-ending game of medieval gotcha, and you're always the one getting got. The financial pressure was relentless, a constant, gnawing worry. You remember all those innovative taxes we talked about? They hit the barons hardest. John demanded scutage, payments in lieu of military service, more frequently and at higher rates than any king before him. And he wasn't just doing it to fund wars. He was doing it to line his own coffers, to pay off debts, and to fund his increasingly unpopular expeditions to France. You'd pay up, expecting a call to arms that never came, or a successful campaign that never materialized. It felt like throwing good money after bad. Only the money was your family's legacy, and the bad was John's latest strategic miscalculation. It wasn't just the money, though that was a huge part of it. It was the principle. John was seen as disrespectful of feudal law, of the ancient customs that governed the relationship between king and subject. He would often act outside the established legal framework, making decisions on a whim or simply ignoring precedent. If you had a dispute with a neighbor, you couldn't rely on the king's court to be impartial. John might side with whoever offered him the most or whoever he thought he could intimidate more effectively. It was a legal system that operated less like a court of law and more like a medieval game show where John was the host, the judge, and the one who got to keep all the prizes. As you grumble to your stewards, you start hearing similar complaints from other barons. Whispers turn into hushed conversations in the castle courtyards. Did you hear what John did to Baron Fitzwilliam? Can you believe the fine he levied on the Earl of Chester? Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, these individual grievances begin to coalesce. You realize you're not alone in your misery. It's like everyone's been suffering in silence, posting vague complaints on their medieval equivalent of social media, and then suddenly someone says, "Hey, who else thinks this is getting ridiculous?" and a whole thread of agreement lights up. John's personality certainly didn't help. He was known for being suspicious, vindictive, and lacking the kind of charismatic leadership that might have inspired loyalty despite his faults. Unlike his brother, Richard the Lionheart, who, for all his flaws, was seen as a warrior king, John was perceived as a petty tyrant, prone to fits of rage and utterly unreliable. He wasn't someone you felt proud to serve. He was someone you feared, and someone you resented. He didn't just demand obedience. He demanded subservience, and barons, by their very nature, weren't big fans of subservience, especially when it came from someone they increasingly viewed as unworthy. The turning point wasn't a single event, but a slow, simmering boil. The loss of Normandy and other French territories, which we touched upon earlier, was a huge blow to the barons, many of whom had lands and interests across the Channel. Not only did John lose the lands, but his repeated, expensive, and ultimately futile attempts to regain them further drained the barons' resources and patience. Each failed campaign was another nail in the coffin of their loyalty. It was like paying for a premium subscription service that promised amazing content but only ever delivered buffering screens and error messages. As the discontent grew, the barons, despite their own rivalries and internal squabbles, because let's be honest, medieval politics was basically one big family drama with swords, began to seek common ground. They started to meet, initially discreetly, perhaps at tournaments or feasting gatherings that provided a convenient cover for their true intentions. You'd find yourself sharing a tankard of ale with a baron you'd previously considered a competitor, only to discover you both shared the exact same, burning grievances against the king. It was a strange kind of unity, forged in mutual suffering and shared indignation. One mainstream historical fact that underscores this brewing rebellion is the sheer scale of John's financial demands. Between 1207 and 1214, John collected more in scutage than all his predecessors combined over the previous 50 years. This wasn't just a slight increase. It was an unprecedented financial squeeze that left the barons feeling utterly exploited and robbed. They weren't just paying taxes. They felt like they were funding John's personal failures and lavish lifestyle. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this period involves the role of the church, even after John's humiliation by the Pope. Many churchmen, even those who had initially supported John, grew increasingly sympathetic to the barons' plight. Archbishop Stephen Langton, a key figure in the lead-up to Magna Carta, had been appointed by the Pope and was a firm believer in the rule of law, even for kings. He essentially became a bridge between the disgruntled barons and a more principled approach to kingship, guiding them towards articulating their demands not just as personal grievances, but as a restoration of ancient liberties. It's almost as if the medieval equivalent of a wise old mentor stepped in and said, "All right, lads, let's get organized and put this down on paper." Historians still argue whether the barons' primary motivation was truly a desire for justice and good governance, or simply self-interest and a return to their traditional feudal privileges that John had so flagrantly disregarded. It's a bit of both, of course. They certainly wanted their own rights protected, but those rights were often intertwined with the broader concept of lawful rule. They wanted a king who respected the rules, not just one who made them up as he went along. The barons weren't just grumbling. They were actively seeking a solution. They started to look back to past charters and precedents to find a legal basis for their demands. They remembered the coronation charters of previous kings, promises made at the beginning of reigns that were often quickly forgotten. They started to formulate their own list of grievances, a sort of medieval Dear John letter, but instead of breaking up, they were threatening to break the kingdom. This period saw the gradual formation of a powerful, unified faction, primarily among the northern barons, who were perhaps furthest from John's direct influence and often bore the brunt of his capricious demands. These northerners, as they were sometimes called, became the vanguard of the rebellion. They were tired of John's broken promises, his arbitrary seizures of land and property, and his constant demands for money without delivering on his end of the feudal bargain. They were also deeply offended by his perceived cowardice and incompetence, especially after the disastrous defeat at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214, which effectively ended John's hopes of reclaiming his French territories. This loss was the final straw for many, proving beyond a doubt that John was not only a tyrant but also a military failure. Imagine the tension building. Meetings in secret, messengers riding under the cover of darkness, coded messages exchanged. It's like a medieval spy thriller, but instead of trying to save the world, they're trying to save their estates and their dignity. The barons, previously a collection of often warring individuals, were slowly, painfully, forging themselves into a unified force, driven by shared suffering and a growing sense of injustice. They were no longer just complaining. They were organizing. They were drawing up lists. They were preparing to act. And their target was the very king who had pushed them to this breaking point. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation, one that would forever change the course of English history. Word count: 1,489. Awaiting continue ## section 9. You've seen King John's trajectory, his path paved with strategic blunders, spiritual defiance, and financial innovations that would make a modern-day tax collector blush. But as these actions piled up, one on top of the other, they weren't just abstract events happening to a kingdom. They were directly impacting the powerful, land-owning barons who formed the backbone of England's military and social structure. And let me tell you, if there's one thing a medieval baron loved more than a good feast, it was their feudal rights and their family's land. John, unfortunately for him, seemed determined to trample all over both. Imagine yourself, a proud baron, lord of your own lands, with knights sworn to your service, and a lineage stretching back generations. You've always understood that your fealty to the king comes with certain expectations: protection, justice, and a respect for established customs. But under John, that unspoken contract, that delicate balance of power, felt like it was constantly being rewritten, usually in John's favor, and usually with a very large, expensive pen. You begin to notice the chill wind of arbitrary justice blowing through the land. Perhaps a rival baron, someone John dislikes, suddenly finds their lands seized on a flimsy pretext, or is hit with an exorbitant fine for a minor transgression. Then it's your turn. Maybe John demands an astronomical sum for your son's inheritance, or insists on holding your own children as hostages to ensure your loyalty. A common practice, yes, but John pushed it to an unprecedented level, often taking the children of barons who were already perfectly loyal, just because he could. It's like your king just decided to play a never-ending game of medieval gotcha, and you're always the one getting got. The financial pressure was relentless, a constant, gnawing worry. You remember all those innovative taxes we talked about? They hit the barons hardest. John demanded scutage payments in lieu of military service, more frequently and at higher rates than any king before him. And he wasn't just doing it to fund wars. He was doing it to line his own coffers, to pay off debts, and to fund his increasingly unpopular expeditions to France. You'd pay up expecting a call to arms that never came, or a successful campaign that never materialized. It felt like throwing good money after bad. Only the money was your family's legacy, and the bad was John's latest strategic miscalculation. It wasn't just the money, though that was a huge part of it. It was the principle. John was seen as disrespectful of feudal law, of the ancient customs that governed the relationship between king and subject. He would often act outside the established legal framework, making decisions on a whim or simply ignoring precedent. If you had a dispute with a neighbor, you couldn't rely on the king's court to be impartial. John might side with whoever offered him the most or whoever he thought he could intimidate more effectively. It was a legal system that operated less like a court of law and more like a medieval game show where John was the host, the judge, and the one who got to keep all the prizes. As you grumble to your stewards, you start hearing similar complaints from other barons. Whispers turn into hushed conversations in the castle courtyards. Did you hear what John did to Baron Fitzwilliam? Can you believe the fine he levied on the Earl of Chester? Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, these individual grievances begin to coalesce. You realize you're not alone in your misery. It's like everyone's been suffering in silence, posting vague complaints on their medieval equivalent of social media, and then suddenly someone says, "Hey, who else thinks this is getting ridiculous?" And a whole thread of agreement lights up. John's personality certainly didn't help. He was known for being suspicious, vindictive, and lacking the kind of charismatic leadership that might have inspired loyalty despite his faults. Unlike his brother, Richard the Lionheart, who, for all his flaws, was seen as a warrior king, John was perceived as a petty tyrant, prone to fits of rage and utterly unreliable. He wasn't someone you felt proud to serve. He was someone you feared, and someone you resented. He didn't just demand obedience. He demanded subservience, and barons, by their very nature, weren't big fans of subservience, especially when it came from someone they increasingly viewed as unworthy. The turning point wasn't a single event, but a slow, simmering boil. The loss of Normandy and other French territories, which we touched upon earlier, was a huge blow to the barons, many of whom had lands and interests across the Channel. Not only did John lose the lands, but his repeated, expensive, and ultimately futile attempts to regain them further drained the barons' resources and patience. Each failed campaign was another nail in the coffin of their loyalty. It was like paying for a premium subscription service that promised amazing content but only ever delivered buffering screens and error messages. As the discontent grew, the barons, despite their own rivalries and internal squabbles, because let's be honest, medieval politics was basically one big family drama with swords, began to seek common ground. They started to meet, initially discreetly, perhaps at tournaments or feasting gatherings that provided a convenient cover for their true intentions. You'd find yourself sharing a tankard of ale with a baron you'd previously considered a competitor, only to discover you both shared the exact same, burning grievances against the king. It was a strange kind of unity, forged in mutual suffering and shared indignation. One mainstream historical fact that underscores this brewing rebellion is the sheer scale of John's financial demands. Between 1207 and 1214, John collected more in scutage than all his predecessors combined over the previous 50 years. This wasn't just a slight increase. It was an unprecedented financial squeeze that left the barons feeling utterly exploited and robbed. They weren't just paying taxes. They felt like they were funding John's personal failures and lavish lifestyle. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this period involves the role of the church, even after John's humiliation by the Pope. Many churchmen, even those who had initially supported John, grew increasingly sympathetic to the barons' plight. Archbishop Stephen Langton, a key figure in the lead-up to Magna Carta, had been appointed by the Pope and was a firm believer in the rule of law, even for kings. He essentially became a bridge between the disgruntled barons and a more principled approach to kingship, guiding them towards articulating their demands not just as personal grievances, but as a restoration of ancient liberties. It's almost as if the medieval equivalent of a wise old mentor stepped in and said, "All right, lads, let's get organized and put this down on paper." Historians still argue whether the barons' primary motivation was truly a desire for justice and good governance, or simply self-interest and a return to their traditional feudal privileges that John had so flagrantly disregarded. It's a bit of both, of course. They certainly wanted their own rights protected, but those rights were often intertwined with the broader concept of lawful rule. They wanted a king who respected the rules, not just one who made them up as he went along. The barons weren't just grumbling. They were actively seeking a solution. They started to look back to past charters and precedents to find a legal basis for their demands. They remembered the coronation charters of previous kings, promises made at the beginning of reigns that were often quickly forgotten. They started to formulate their own list of grievances, a sort of medieval Dear John letter, but instead of breaking up, they were threatening to break the kingdom. This period saw the gradual formation of a powerful, unified faction, primarily among the northern barons, who were perhaps furthest from John's direct influence and often bore the brunt of his capricious demands. These northerners, as they were sometimes called, became the vanguard of the rebellion. They were tired of John's broken promises, his arbitrary seizures of land and property, and his constant demands for money without delivering on his end of the feudal bargain. They were also deeply offended by his perceived cowardice and incompetence, especially after the disastrous defeat at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214, which effectively ended John's hopes of reclaiming his French territories. This loss was the final straw for many, proving beyond a doubt that John was not only a tyrant but also a military failure. Imagine the tension building. Meetings in secret, messengers riding under the cover of darkness, coded messages exchanged. It's like a medieval spy thriller, but instead of trying to save the world, they're trying to save their estates and their dignity. The barons, previously a collection of often warring individuals, were slowly, painfully, forging themselves into a unified force, driven by shared suffering and a growing sense of injustice. They were no longer just complaining. They were organizing. They were drawing up lists. They were preparing to act. And their target was the very king who had pushed them to this breaking point. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation, one that would forever change the course of English history. Word count: 1,489. Awaiting continue. Section 10. You've witnessed John's relentless tyranny, his almost pathological inability to share power or even feign good faith. You've felt the weight of his taxes, the chill of his interdict, and the sting of his humiliations. Now, as the spring of 1215 blossoms into a reluctant English summer, you find yourself on a slow, deliberate march, not with a king, but against one. You are among the barons, their heavy boots thudding a rhythm of defiance on the muddy tracks, their mail glinting under a sometimes sunny, sometimes threatening sky. Imagine the atmosphere. A strange blend of grim determination and nervous anticipation. These aren't just disgruntled nobles grumbling in their drafty castles anymore. This is an army, albeit one united by a shared grievance rather than a single banner. They've come from the north, from the east, from every corner of the kingdom where John's oppressive grip had squeezed too hard. You can almost hear the creak of leather, the jingle of spurs, the low murmur of voices discussing grievances and hopes. It's like a medieval road trip, except instead of heading to a theme park, you're off to confront the most difficult boss in the history of bosses. And you're all armed, just in case. King John, meanwhile, is not exactly eager for this reunion. He's been holed up at Windsor Castle, a formidable fortress, no doubt pacing its stone halls like a trapped wolf. He knows they're coming. He's tried everything. Charming them, threatening them, even appealing to the Pope again, to declare their rebellion unlawful. But this time, his usual bag of tricks is empty. The barons, led by men like Robert Fitzwalter and Eustace de Vesey, are past the point of negotiation or intimidation. Their patience, thinner than a medieval monk's hair after a bad day, has finally snapped. So, as June unfurls its green tapestry, you find yourself trudging towards a place that will forever be etched into the very bedrock of legal history: Runnymede. It's not a grand city, not a fortified castle, but a wide, open meadow beside the meandering River Thames, roughly halfway between the royal stronghold of Windsor and the rebellious baronial stronghold of Staines. Think of it as the ultimate neutral ground, chosen perhaps because it offered no strategic advantage to either side, just flat, open space where everyone could see everyone else. No sneaky ambushes, no hidden tunnels, just good old-fashioned face-to-face confrontation. It's the kind of place you'd pick for a picnic, not a pivotal moment in constitutional law, which, if you think about it, is rather charmingly British. You arrive with the baronial host, a formidable assembly of armed knights, their retainers and countless squires, pages, and servants. It's less a single army and more a collection of armed camps, spreading across the verdant floodplains. The air hums with a palpable tension. You can smell the wood smoke from countless cooking fires, hear the distant whinny of horses, and the low, constant hum of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of men waiting. This isn't a quick meeting. It's a standoff, a medieval summit meeting where the agenda is King John, you need to chill. On the other side of the meadow, or perhaps across a narrow stretch of the Thames, King John's smaller, but still significant, retinue has also set up camp. His loyalists, his mercenaries, his household knights, they are there. A stark reminder of the power he still wielded, even if it was waning. You can imagine the two sides eyeing each other across the green expanse, like two rival football teams before the big game, except the stakes are a bit higher than a trophy. More like, the future of England. Days pass. The sun rises and sets, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple over the quiet Thames. It's not an immediate confrontation. There are initial exchanges, messages carried by nervous intermediaries, back and forth across the damp grass. John, ever the procrastinator and schemer, tries to delay, to divide, to find any loophole. He proposes arbitration by a committee of bishops, He suggests appealing to the Pope again, because that worked so well last time. He tries to buy time. He's like that friend who keeps saying, "I'm 5 minutes away," when they haven't even left the house. But the barons are resolute. They've tasted his promises too many times. They know his game. Their demands are clear, unified, and non-negotiable. They are not asking for his crown. They are demanding that he rule justly, that he abide by the ancient customs and laws of the land, that he respect their rights as feudal lords and, by extension, the rights of free men. They are demanding a formal charter, a written document, that will bind him and future kings to these principles. It's a truly revolutionary concept for the time, the idea that a king, God's anointed, could be subject to the law, constrained by the will of his subjects. Imagine the scene on that fateful day, June 15, 1215. The morning mist likely still clinging to the meadow grass as the two parties finally converged. You might see the king, dressed in his royal finery, perhaps looking rather less regal than he usually tried to project. His face a mask of barely concealed fury and resentment. He's surrounded by his closest advisors, some loyal, some merely pragmatic, all likely sweating under the pressure. Facing him is the formidable array of barons, their faces etched with the strain of months of rebellion and the weight of their collective purpose. They are unified, grimly determined, and armed. They are not here to beg. They are here to demand. This is not a polite request for a slight adjustment to the royal budget. This is a full-blown intervention, medieval style. It's like a family meeting where everyone tells Uncle John he needs to stop being, well, Uncle John. Mainstream historical fact asterisk. It was indeed on June 15, 1215, that King John finally met the barons at Runnymede, bowing to their immense pressure and the threat of continued civil war. This date is now widely recognized as a pivotal moment in the development of constitutional law. The barons present their Articles of the Barons, a draft document outlining their grievances and proposed solutions. It's a lengthy list detailing specific abuses of royal power, oppressive taxes, and infringements on feudal rights. They are demanding that the king acknowledge that even he is not above the law, that there are limits to his authority. This is a profound shift in thinking, moving away from the absolute power of the monarch towards a more contractual relationship between ruler and ruled. Quirky/fringe tidbit asterisk. One of the less talked about aspects of the Runnymede gathering is the sheer logistical challenge. Feeding and housing thousands of men, horses, and their retinue for several days in an open field would have been an immense undertaking. Imagine the mud, the makeshift latrines, the constant hum of activity, and the sheer volume of supplies needed. It was less like a formal treaty signing and more like a very large, very tense medieval music festival, but with swords instead of guitars. John, despite his initial bluster and attempts to evade, finds himself truly cornered. His military options are limited. The barons have the numbers and, more importantly, they have the will. His reputation is in tatters, his coffers are depleted, and his kingdom is teetering on the brink of outright civil war. He has no choice but to listen. He sits or stands, perhaps slumped, as the demands are read, one by one. You can almost hear his teeth grinding. He's not agreeing out of conviction, but out of sheer, unadulterated necessity. Open scholarly debate phrase asterisk. Historians still argue whether John genuinely intended to uphold any agreement from the start, or if he merely played for time, hoping for an opportunity to renege on his promises once the immediate danger had passed. Was there a flicker of understanding in his eyes, or just the cold calculation of a man trapped? This is the moment of forced accord. It's not a friendly handshake. It's the surrender of a cornered animal. The barons have him, not by brute force on a battlefield, but by the sheer weight of their unified opposition and the threat of what would happen if he refused. They have brought him to this muddy field, not as a king dictating terms, but as a ruler being dictated to. The balance of power, for this brief, shining moment, has shifted. The stage is set for a document that will echo through centuries, a document born of tyranny, rebellion, and a king's ultimate humiliation. But that, my friend, is a story for tomorrow. For now, let the quiet of Runnymede settle around you, a meadow forever changed by the desperate demands of disgruntled men and the reluctant submission of a terrible king. Section 11. Now, picture yourself standing on that damp, reedy meadow near Runnymede, the air thick with the unspoken tension of a king cornered and a nobility utterly fed up. You can almost hear the rustle of the banners in the breeze, the distant bleating of sheep, and the grumbling of 1,000 stomachs. King John, looking less like a majestic monarch and more like a child told to eat his vegetables, is finally ready to concede. But this isn't just any concession. This is the moment that will birth a document, a promise etched onto parchment, that will echo through centuries. This is the moment of Magna Carta. You see, what the barons brought with them wasn't just a list of grievances. It was a blueprint for a different kind of kingdom. They weren't just asking for a better tax plan or a nicer king. They were demanding something truly revolutionary. They wanted to draw a line in the sand, or rather, in the ink. And this line, dear listener, would forever change the relationship between the ruler and the ruled. Imagine the scene. The barons, perhaps still a little breathless from their pursuit, present John with a document initially known as the Articles of the Barons. It's not yet the grand Magna Carta, the Great Charter. That name would come a few years later, perhaps because it was simply a big document compared to other charters, or perhaps because its implications were so profoundly significant. But even in its raw, unpolished form, it was a colossal deal. You can almost hear John sighing dramatically, perhaps muttering under his breath, "Oh, for heaven's sake, how many paragraphs do you people need?" This document, initially sealed by John on June 15, 1215, was a groundbreaking attempt to curb absolute monarchical power. For centuries, English kings had largely operated on the principle that their word was law, their will absolute. They could tax whom they pleased, imprison whom they pleased, and generally make life miserable for anyone who got in their way. But the Magna Carta proposed a radical idea. Even the king was subject to the law. It's like telling a particularly stubborn toddler that, no, they can't actually eat all the crayons. A revelation. Let's delve into some of these revolutionary articles, shall we? They're like the original terms and conditions of a very important, if somewhat reluctantly agreed upon, contract. First, and perhaps most famously, you have Clause 39. This one is a real heavyweight, the undisputed champion of the Magna Carta. It states, "No free man shall be seized or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled, or deprived of his standing in any other way, nor will we proceed with force against him, or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land." Take a moment to let that sink in. This isn't just for the fancy dukes and earls. It's for any free man. It's the foundational stone for what we now call due process of law. Before this, John could pretty much throw anyone he disliked into a dungeon on a whim. Now, he had to, follow some rules. It's almost as if the barons had invented the concept of, "Hey, wait a minute." Closely tied to this is Clause 40. "To no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice." Imagine that. Justice not for sale. No more waiting around for years for your case to be heard, or having to bribe a royal official just to get a fair shake. It sounds so basic to us now, but back then, it was a genuine game changer. It meant that justice, theoretically, was available to everyone, not just those with deep pockets or royal connections. You can almost picture the barons thinking, "Finally, we can stop paying extra for the express lane in the justice system." Then there's the money issue, which, let's be honest, was probably at the very top of the barons' things that annoy us about John's list. Clause 12 is critical here. "No scutage or aid shall be imposed in our kingdom unless by common council of our kingdom." Scutage was a tax paid by a knight instead of military service, and aids were various feudal levies. Essentially, this clause meant that the king couldn't just demand money whenever he felt like it. He had to consult with his tenants-in-chief, the barons, first. This is the seed of the idea of no taxation without representation, a concept that would blossom centuries later and even inspire revolutions. It was a direct assault on the king's arbitrary financial power, forcing him to seek consent rather than simply command. It was like telling a teenager they couldn't just raid the fridge whenever they wanted. They had to ask first. The Magna Carta also addressed the freedom of the English Church. Clause 1 stated that the English Church shall be free, and shall have its rights undiminished, and its liberties unimpaired. This was a direct response to John's previous clash with Pope Innocent III. The barons wanted to ensure that the church, and by extension, their own spiritual lives, were not subject to the king's whims. It was a bit like declaring, "Look, God's business is God's business. Okay? You stay out of it, John." But it wasn't just about the big, sweeping principles. The Magna Carta was also incredibly detailed, addressing a myriad of feudal rights and grievances that had been trampled by John's heavy-handed rule. You see, the barons weren't just abstract philosophers. They were practical men with very real problems. Asterisk feudal reliefs. Asterisk the charter set fixed rates for reliefs, the payments made by an heir to inherit land. John had been charging exorbitant amounts, effectively holding inheritances for ransom. Now there was a cap. Asterisk wardship and marriage. Asterisk it protected the rights of heirs during their minority and ensured that widows could not be forced into remarriage against their will, nor could their dowries be seized. This was a significant protection for women in a male-dominated society, ensuring they weren't simply pawns in a king's game of strategic alliances or financial exploitation. Asterisk forest law. Asterisk John had expanded royal forests and imposed harsh forest laws, which were deeply unpopular. The Magna Carta promised to limit these royal forests and ease the severity of their laws. Imagine being fined for picking up a fallen twig. That's the kind of petty tyranny they were trying to stop. Asterisk standardization. Asterisk it even included clauses about standardizing weights and measures throughout the kingdom. So, no more getting shortchanged on your grain because the local lord had a special bushel. This was a nod to facilitating fair trade and commerce, benefiting not just the barons but merchants and common folk too. It's a bit like finally getting everyone to agree on what a cup means in a recipe. Historians still argue whether the barons truly intended to create a universal document for all free men, or if it was primarily a self-serving charter designed to protect their own class interests and feudal rights. While many of its clauses certainly benefited the nobility, the language of free man, and the inclusion of clauses benefiting merchants and even some towns suggest a broader, if perhaps unintended, impact. It certainly laid the groundwork for future interpretations that would extend these rights to more and more people over time. One quirky tidbit about the Magna Carta is that it even addressed fish weirs. Clause 33 stated that all fish weirs shall be removed from the Thames, the Medway, and throughout the whole of England except on the sea coast. These weirs, essentially traps, were obstructing river navigation and depleting fish stocks. It seems even in their grand legal revolution, the barons couldn't resist a little environmental protection and navigational efficiency. It's like they were saying, "We're busy reforming the monarchy, but also, could we please get some decent salmon around here?" The significance of the Magna Carta lies not just in its individual clauses, but in the overarching principle it asserted, that the king was not above the law. It established a concept of limited government, placing constraints on royal authority and asserting the rights of subjects. It was a bold declaration that there were certain fundamental liberties that even a monarch could not infringe upon. It was, in essence, a promise that justice would be fair, that taxes would be levied with consent, and that no one, not even the king, could act with absolute impunity. This was a profoundly uncomfortable moment for John. He had to put his royal seal on a document that systematically dismantled much of his power, a power he had so ruthlessly exploited. You can almost feel the resentment simmering beneath his forced compliance. He was agreeing to this, not out of conviction, but out of sheer necessity, with the barons breathing down his neck and the threat of civil war hanging heavy in the air. For the barons, it was a triumph, a moment where they finally got their way, where they forced their king to bend. The parchment crackled with the energy of a new era, or so they hoped. This document, with its many clauses, was a groundbreaking attempt to codify rights and responsibilities in a way that had never been done before in England. It wasn't a perfect document, and it certainly wasn't a democratic one in the modern sense. It didn't grant rights to peasants or serfs, who made up the vast majority of the population. But it was a crucial first step, a foundational stone upon which future concepts of liberty and constitutional government would be built. The promise of Magna Carta was that the rule of law, not the rule of a single man, would ultimately prevail. It was a beacon of hope, a whisper of a future where power was balanced and justice was a right, not a privilege. But as you drift deeper into this historical slumber, remember that a promise, however grand, is only as good as the intention behind it. And King John, as you've already gathered, was not exactly known for his unwavering commitment to promises. The ink was barely dry on this momentous charter before the seeds of its betrayal were already being sown. Section 12. You stand on the damp, reedy ground of Runnymede, the ink still fresh on the parchment of Magna Carta. A collective sigh of relief, audible almost as a whisper across the meadow, seems to rise from the gathering of barons and their retinues. The tension, which had been stretched taut for weeks, finally snaps, leaving behind a fragile, almost unbelievable sense of peace. You see the barons, some of them grizzled veterans of countless campaigns, exchange weary but hopeful glances. They believe they have secured something truly monumental, a promise etched in ink that will forever bind the king to the law. And then you look at King John. He stands there, a peculiar, almost theatrical smile plastered across his face. It's a smile that doesn't quite reach his eyes, a thin, almost brittle expression that sets a shiver down your spine. He's nodding, accepting the congratulations of his few loyalists, shaking hands, making a show of gracious compliance. But if you listen closely, if you really listen past the polite murmurings and the rustle of the wind through the tall grass, you can almost hear the gears turning in his cunning, calculating mind. It's the sound of a trap door closing, not opening. You see him almost immediately dispatching messengers. Their horses are already saddled, their cloaks flapping in the breeze as they gallop away from the field. One heading north, another south, and a very important one, you just know it, thundering east towards the coast. These aren't messages of peace and reconciliation. Oh no, dear listener. These are urgent, clandestine instructions, the first moves in a chess game designed to overturn everything that just transpired. John, you realize, never had any intention of honoring the Great Charter. For him, Runnymede wasn't a negotiation. It was merely a temporary inconvenience, a strategic pause in his relentless pursuit of absolute power. Think of it like signing up for a free trial online and immediately looking for the cancel subscription button. John was already halfway there. His strategy is as old as kings themselves: appeal to a higher authority. And in medieval Europe, there was no higher authority, no greater power than the Pope. Remember Pope Innocent III, the same powerful pontiff to whom John had so humiliatingly submitted just a few years prior, even offering England as a papal fiefdom? Well, that abject surrender was now John's ace in the hole. He'd paid his dues, literally, to the Holy See, and now he expected a return on his investment. You can almost picture the scene in Rome. John's carefully chosen envoys, probably looking suitably distraught and earnest, arrive at the Lateran Palace. They paint a vivid picture for the Pope. A king, God's anointed, coerced and humiliated by rebellious, greedy barons. They argue that Magna Carta was signed under duress, an affront to royal authority, an attack on the very concept of divine right. More importantly, they remind the Pope that England is now, technically, his vassal state, and this charter directly undermines his suzerainty. How could the Pope allow such a precedent, where rebellious subjects could dictate terms to a monarch, especially one who had placed his kingdom under papal protection? Pope Innocent III, a formidable figure who believed deeply in the supremacy of the papacy over secular rulers, listens intently. He sees the charter not as a step towards justice, but as an act of insolence, a dangerous precedent that could destabilize other kingdoms and undermine his own vast spiritual and temporal authority. Furthermore, he views the charter as an attempt to diminish the king's power, which, in his eyes, was divinely ordained. This was not just a squabble between a king and his nobles. It was an attack on the established order, an order the Pope was sworn to uphold. And so, you feel the chill wind of betrayal blow across England as the papal bull, Etsi Carissimus, although most dear, arrives. It is dated August 24, 1215, a mere 10 weeks after Runnymede. Imagine the shock, the cold dread that washes over the barons when the news spreads. The document, written in the stern, uncompromising language of the Holy See, declares Magna Carta not just invalid, but null and void of all validity forever. It states that the charter was extorted by violence and fear, and that it was shameful and demeaning for the king, prejudicial to royal rights, and a grave dishonor to the apostolic see. It even threatens excommunication for anyone who attempts to uphold it. It's like signing a meticulously detailed contract, shaking hands, and then, before you've even left the room, the other party pulls out a magical eraser and makes the entire thing disappear. All that painstaking negotiation, all those careful clauses, all the hopes for a more just future, instantly obliterated by a stroke of a pen in faraway Rome. Poof, just like that. It's enough to make you sigh in exasperation. You might even wonder if John had a little celebration party after receiving the good news, perhaps with some fine wine and a villainous cackle. With the Pope's backing, John's true colors, always a rather murky shade, now shine in their full tyrannical glory. The thin smile vanishes. The pretense of compliance is discarded like a worn-out cloak. This is the mainstream historical fact that underscores John's character. He immediately sought and successfully obtained papal annulment of Magna Carta, proving his lack of sincerity at Runnymede. His agents, who had been quietly recruiting mercenaries on the continent even before the charter was annulled, now work with renewed vigor. Flemish crossbowmen, Brabancan pikemen, Poitevin knights, hardened, ruthless soldiers of fortune, begin to pour into England, ready to fight for the highest bidder. John is building an army designed not to defend his realm from foreign invaders, but to crush his own subjects. You feel the atmosphere shift. The fragile peace that had settled over England after Runnymede shatters into a million sharp pieces. The barons, initially stunned, then enraged, realize they have been played for fools. Their carefully constructed legal bulwark against tyranny has been demolished by the combined forces of royal cunning and papal authority. There's a story, perhaps apocryphal but certainly fitting, that John, upon hearing of the annulment, laughed so heartily he almost choked on his dinner. This quirky tidbit, whether true or not, perfectly captures the king's vindictive nature. What do you do when your king, who swore an oath before God and man, then has that oath declared void by the highest spiritual authority? You prepare for war. The barons, who had disbanded their forces after Runnymede, now scramble to remobilize. Castles are fortified, supplies are gathered, and men are called to arms. The Great Charter, meant to bring peace, has instead become the catalyst for civil war. You can almost hear the clang of hammers on anvils, the shouts of drill sergeants, the nervous chatter in the villages as young men are conscripted. The roads, once relatively safe for merchants, become perilous as royalist and baronial forces clash in skirmishes. The English countryside, which had just begun to breathe a sigh of relief, is now plunged into chaos. It's like watching a really bad reality TV show where the contestants sign a peace treaty, only to immediately backstab each other the moment the cameras are off. The conflict that erupts is known as the First Barons' War. It's not just a rebellion. It's a fight for the very soul of England. On one side, you have King John, backed by the Pope and an army of foreign mercenaries, determined to reassert his absolute, unchecked authority. On the other, you have the defiant barons, fighting for the principles enshrined, however briefly, in Magna Carta, for limited government, for justice, for a king who respects the law. Historians still argue whether John ever truly intended to honor the charter, or if his agreement at Runnymede was a calculated deception from the very beginning. Was there a fleeting moment of genuine concession, or was it always a theatrical performance, a delaying tactic to buy time and gather strength? Given his track record, his history of broken promises and ruthless ambition, it's hard to imagine his sincerity. He had a reputation for treachery long before Runnymede, and this latest act of betrayal only cemented his infamous status. The betrayal of Magna Carta wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was a profound psychological blow. It shattered whatever remaining trust existed between the king and his subjects. It proved that John's word meant nothing, that his oaths were as fleeting as morning mist. And so, the land you walk through is no longer one of uneasy truce, but one bracing for the storm. The drums of war are beating, and England, once again, is about to be consumed by the flames of conflict, all because a king refused to be bound by the very promises he made. Section 13. So, you know how it goes. You've just spent ages negotiating a really important document. Everyone shakes hands, and then, almost immediately, one party winks, rips it up and says, "Nah, just kidding." That's exactly what happens after Runnymede. You've barely had time to wipe the mud from your boots from that little field trip, and King John, with a twinkle in his eye and a papal bull clutched in his fist, declares the Magna Carta null and void. He's been given the Pope's blessing to ignore it, after all, and you can practically hear him humming a little tune of triumph as he does so. He truly believes he's outmaneuvered everyone, that this whole messy business is over. Oh, if only it were that simple. Instead, you feel the air crackle with a different kind of tension now, far colder than the spring breeze at Runnymede. It's the icy calm before a storm of iron and fire that's about to sweep across England. The barons, those proud, powerful men who had dared to stand up to their king, are not just angry. They are utterly, incandescently furious. They haven't just been betrayed. They've been publicly humiliated. Their solemn oaths and hard-won concessions tossed aside like yesterday's leftovers. This isn't just about rights anymore. It's personal. And when things get personal in medieval politics, you know it's time to duck for cover. You see the immediate consequence. The First Barons' War explodes. It's not a polite, organized conflict with clear battle lines. Oh no, it's a messy, brutal free-for-all. A patchwork quilt of sieges, skirmishes, and shifting loyalties. John, despite his years and the general disarray of his kingdom, displays a surprising burst of energy. You might expect a king who just reneged on a peace treaty to be, well, a bit tired. But John, oh no, he's just getting started. It's like when you cancel plans last minute and then suddenly have all this boundless energy for something else. Except for John, that something else was civil war. He moves quickly, his mercenary forces, often referred to as aliens by the English chroniclers, tearing through the countryside, pillaging and punishing those who dared to defy him. You watch as castle after castle falls to John's swift, often ruthless campaigns. He's particularly effective at siege warfare, a skill he'd honed over years of trying to reclaim lost territories in France. The rebel barons, caught off guard by his sudden vigor and the ferocity of his hired muscle, find themselves on the defensive, their grand plans for a more just England crumbling faster than a stale biscuit. They realize, with dawning horror, that they might have poked a sleeping dragon, and now it's wide awake and breathing fire. They need help, and they need it fast. This is where the story takes a truly dramatic turn, one that sends shivers down your spine even centuries later. In their desperation, facing a king who seems utterly unhinged and unstoppable, the rebellious barons do something truly radical, something that speaks volumes about their utter contempt for John. They look across the narrow, choppy waters of the English Channel, and they extend an invitation to England's traditional enemy. They invite Prince Louis, the son and heir of King Philip II Augustus of France, to come and take the English throne. Yes, you heard that right. The very same French royal family that had been constantly at war with England for generations, the very same one that John had lost so much land to. Why Louis? Well, he has a tenuous but undeniable claim through his wife, Blanche of Castile, who happens to be John's niece. It's a bit of a stretch, a genealogical gymnastics routine, but in the convoluted world of medieval succession, it's enough. The barons, bless their hearts, were probably thinking, we just wanted a bit of peace and quiet, maybe some lower taxes. Now we're hosting a French prince and dodging arrows. This escalated quickly, didn't it? It's like ordering a small pizza and getting a full-blown banquet you didn't ask for. You feel the palpable shift in the air as the news spreads. This isn't just a rebellion anymore. It's an international crisis, a full-blown invasion. Prince Louis, meanwhile, must have felt like he'd won the medieval lottery. An all-expenses-paid trip to England, with the promise of a crown at the end? Sign him up. Though, crossing the channel in a medieval boat probably wasn't quite the luxury cruise he'd imagined. He gathers a formidable fleet and a substantial army, and in May 1216 you witness his landing at Sandwich in Kent. The sight must have been truly terrifying for John's loyalists. Hundreds of ships, banners snapping in the wind, disgorging thousands of French knights and soldiers onto English soil. Louis's arrival galvanizes the rebel cause. Many English towns and castles, tired of John's relentless tyranny and eager for any alternative, open their gates to the French prince. You even see London, the sprawling heart of the kingdom, welcome him with open arms. They proclaim him King of England, and for a brief, bewildering period, there are essentially two kings in England: John, the anointed but reviled monarch, and Louis, the invading prince with the support of much of the English nobility and the capital city. It's a constitutional nightmare, a political Gordian knot that would take years to untangle. The war now becomes even more complex, a three-sided affair with John's loyalists, the rebel English barons, and the invading French forces all vying for control. You witness the chaos unfold across the land. Louis's forces quickly secure the southeast, pushing inland. He lays siege to key strongholds like Dover Castle, a vital strategic point guarding the gateway to England. The resilience of Dover, under the command of Hubert de Burgh, becomes legendary, a stubborn refusal to yield that ties up significant French resources. This mainstream historical fact, the invitation and subsequent invasion by Prince Louis, who was even proclaimed king in London, is a pivotal moment, showcasing the sheer depths of the barons' desperation and John's alienation. Yet, even with this formidable new opponent, John is not entirely defeated. He refuses to give up, continuing his relentless campaigns in the west and north, often outmaneuvering Louis's forces with surprising speed. He knows the English terrain intimately, and he uses it to his advantage, launching lightning raids, devastating rebel lands, and avoiding direct, pitched battles where his mercenary forces might be outmatched by the combined strength of the French and rebel armies. You can almost hear the weary sighs of the soldiers, French, English, and mercenary alike, as they trudge across the muddy landscape, never quite knowing where John will strike next. The conflict drags on through the summer and autumn of 1216, a brutal war of attrition. You see the devastation it wreaks on the English countryside. Crops burned, villages plundered, the ordinary people caught in the crossfire, suffering immensely regardless of who held power that week. The loyalties of the barons themselves are constantly tested, with some switching sides multiple times depending on which way the wind was blowing, or more accurately, who was winning the latest skirmish. It's a truly bleak period for England, plunged into a civil war exacerbated by foreign invasion. And here's a quirky little tidbit. Despite John having submitted England to the Pope and technically being under papal protection, Prince Louis was actually excommunicated by the papal legate Gualabiceri for invading England. This shows just how tangled and contradictory the political and religious allegiances of the time could be. You'd think the Pope, having just had John bow and scrape, would be all about supporting his new vassal. But no, the papal legate on the ground saw Louis's invasion as a direct threat to the Church's new dominion over England, proving that even the Pope's authority wasn't always a perfectly unified or predictable force in the chaotic arena of medieval power politics. It was less about divine will and more about pragmatic power plays, even for the Church. As the year wears on, the situation remains a stalemate. Louis holds London and much of the southeast, but John still controls significant parts of the west and north, and his mercenaries are still a force to be reckoned with. Neither side can deliver a decisive blow, and the war continues to bleed the kingdom dry. You can feel the exhaustion setting in, a weariness that permeates every layer of society. The grand declarations of Magna Carta feel like a distant dream, replaced by the harsh reality of constant conflict. Historians still argue whether Prince Louis genuinely believed he could become King of England, or if he was merely leveraging a political opportunity to weaken England and strengthen France. Did he truly intend to permanently rule England as a French king, or was he playing a longer game, perhaps aiming to secure advantageous terms for France, or even just to ensure a weaker, more pliable English monarch on the throne? The answer remains elusive, lost in the shifting sands of medieval ambition and the ever-present fog of war. But what is clear is that his presence profoundly destabilized John's already crumbling kingdom, pushing it to the very brink of collapse. The stage is now set, not for a grand resolution, but for a final, desperate act in the tragic reign of King John. Section 14. You find King John, not exactly having a banner year, traversing the treacherous landscape of East Anglia. The First Barons' War rages, His kingdom is a chaotic mess, and his once absolute power feels about as solid as a sandcastle at high tide. He's been scurrying around, trying to rally loyalists, avoid his enemies, and generally keep his head above the swirling waters of rebellion. His destination, or at least his next planned stop, is the relative safety of Newark Castle. To get there, he decides on a route that, in hindsight, was less cunning strategic maneuver and more catastrophic shortcut idea. Imagine, if you will, the scene in mid-October of 1216. The air is crisp, carrying the salty tang of the North Sea. You see John and his entourage, a motley collection of knights, squires, servants, and, crucially, a long train of wagons. These aren't just any wagons. They are the royal baggage train, laden with the very sinews of his power and wealth. Think of it. The royal treasury, not just a few loose coins, but the crown jewels, though not the ones you might imagine twinkling in the Tower of London today, as those came later, the royal regalia, important documents, vast sums of silver and gold coinage and priceless plate. It was, essentially, King John's entire liquid net worth, plus the national piggy bank, all bundled up and rolling along on creaky wheels. Now, John is traveling from Lynn, which we know today as King's Lynn in Norfolk, heading north towards Wisbeach, and then aiming to cross a vast expanse of marshland and tidal estuary known ominously as the Washington. If you look at a map, the Wash is this enormous, square-shaped indentation on England's eastern coast, where several rivers, the Witham, Welland, Nene, and Great Ouse, empty into the North Sea. It's not just a bay. It's a sprawling, low-lying area of salt marshes, mudflats, and shifting sands, crisscrossed by tidal channels. At low tide, it looks like solid ground, deceptive and inviting. At high tide, it transforms into a raging, unpredictable inland sea. It's like Mother Nature's own medieval booby trap, just waiting for an unsuspecting monarch. The traditional crossing point for travelers was a causeway that was only passable at low tide. This was a well-known, albeit perilous, route. The tides in the Wash are notorious for their speed and height, sometimes creating a phenomenon called a tidal bore, a wave that rushes up the narrow river channels, turning placid water into a torrent in minutes. It's a place that demands respect, precision, and an intimate knowledge of its rhythms. No GPS, no Waze, just a local guide who maybe, just maybe, wasn't having his best navigation day. Or perhaps, John was in such a hurry, so desperate to evade the pursuing barons and French forces, that he pushed his luck. So you watch as King John, ever the impatient and rather unlucky sort, decides to take this route. He himself, being a monarch and presumably not wanting to get his royal boots muddy, travels along the higher, safer ground to the west, skirting the edge of the Washington. But his baggage train, that precious convoy of wealth, is directed to take the more direct, lower route across the tidal flats. This was the shortcut. It was probably the most expensive shortcut in English history, easily beating out any toll road you've ever encountered. The wagons, heavy and cumbersome, begin their journey across the exposed seabed. The air is thick with the cries of the teamsters, the squelch of hooves in the soft mud, and the groan of straining timber. They are racing against time, against the relentless, unseen clock of the incoming tide. The plan, if you could call it that, was to make the crossing during the brief window of low tide, before the sea rushed in. But the sea, as it often does, had other plans. Or perhaps the guides miscalculated. Or maybe John's legendary bad luck simply decided to manifest itself in liquid form. Whatever the reason, as the wagons were halfway across, the tide turned. And it didn't just turn. It surged. You can almost feel the sudden chill in the air, the rising murmur of the water, which quickly turns into a roar. The flat, seemingly solid ground begins to disappear beneath a rapidly advancing wall of water. Panic erupts. Horses rear, whinnying in terror. Men shout, scrambling to save what they can. But the water is too fast, too powerful. It sweeps over the causeway, engulfing the wagons. The heavy loads, designed for land travel, become death traps in the swirling currents. The wheels sink into the soft, silty mud, trapping them. The horses, unable to find purchase, are dragged down. In a terrifying, chaotic maelstrom, wagons are overturned, their precious contents spilling into the churning water. Gold coins, silver plate, ornate chalices, official documents bearing the royal seal, all are swallowed by the greedy maw of the wash. Imagine the horror. Not just the material loss, but the sheer, overwhelming realization that everything you've amassed, everything you've extorted, everything that symbolizes your rule, is now being dragged to the bottom of a murky, unforgiving estuary. It's like losing your entire life savings, your passport, and your family heirlooms all at once. Only it's the entire national treasury, and you're a king fighting a civil war. You might think, well, at least he didn't lose his car keys. But for a medieval king, this was infinitely worse. King John, who was reportedly ahead of the main train, some accounts say he was observing from a safe distance, others that he was slightly behind, escapes the immediate catastrophe. He reaches higher ground, safe from the encroaching waters, but he is forced to watch, helpless, as his entire fortune vanishes. The sight must have been utterly soul-crushing. This wasn't just a financial setback. It was a psychological blow of immense proportions. It was a tangible sign, almost a divine judgment, that his reign was crumbling. His luck had run out, and even the very land and sea were conspiring against him. Historians still argue whether John was truly present to witness the disaster, or if he only learned of it later, but the impact on his morale was undeniable. The loss was staggering. It included not only vast sums of money that he desperately needed to pay his mercenaries and prosecute the war, but also the royal regalia, which held immense symbolic power. Losing the crown jewels and the royal seal was akin to losing the very legitimacy of his rule. It was a clear signal to everyone, including his own dwindling supporters, that his star was rapidly fading. Adding a touch of local lore, there are persistent legends, whispered through the centuries, that some of the treasure still lies buried beneath the shifting sands and mud of the Washington treasure hunters, both amateur and professional, have periodically tried their luck, lured by the dream of unearthing King John's lost fortune. While some Roman coins and other artifacts have been found in the area over the years, the exact location of John's lost treasury remains one of England's great unsolved mysteries. It's a quirky tidbit that adds to the almost mythical aura of the disaster. A ghostly reminder of John's catastrophic end. The immediate aftermath of this loss was devastating for John. He was already ill, suffering from dysentery, and this final, crushing blow seemed to break his spirit completely. He continued his journey to Newark, but the vitality had drained from him. The loss of his treasury meant he had no means to continue the fight effectively. His resources were gone, his authority undermined, and his personal resolve shattered. The treasure of the Wash was not just a collection of valuable items. It was the very fuel that kept his tyrannical engine running. Without it, the engine sputtered, coughed, and was about to grind to a final, ignominious halt. This single event, this act of nature, sealed his fate. He never truly recovered from it, physically or mentally. Section 15. You stand now on the precipice of King John's end, a moment not of grand triumph or noble sacrifice, but of a slow, agonizing descent into the abyss of his own making. The thunderous roar of the sea that swallowed his treasury in the Wash still echoes in your mind, a chilling premonition of the finality that awaited him. That catastrophic loss, a blow so profound it would have crippled lesser men, seemed to shatter whatever fragile remnants of his spirit remained. Imagine, if you will, the king, soaked to the bone, staring blankly at the churning waters. His immense wealth, the very sinews of his war effort, the glittering symbols of his power vanishing into the treacherous mud. It wasn't just gold and jewels that disappeared. It was his last vestige of hope, his final, desperate gambit to turn the tide of a war he was demonstrably losing. From that moment, you witness a rapid and irreversible decline. The king, already known for his volatile temper and a constitution perhaps not as robust as his legendary brother Richard's, begins to physically unravel. The relentless strain of campaigning, the constant betrayals, the unyielding pressure of a kingdom in revolt, and now this utterly devastating financial ruin, all converge upon him. You can almost feel the chill of the Lincolnshire fens seeping into his bones, the dampness clinging to his clothes as he tries to make sense of the incomprehensible. It's the kind of stress that doesn't just give you a headache. It eats away at your very core, turning your insides into a tangled mess of nerves and pain. He pushes on, driven by a desperate, almost pathological need to escape the looming threat of Prince Louis and the rebellious barons. His journey south from Lynn is a grim procession. You can picture the beleaguered royal party, trudging through the autumn mud, the horses slipping, the wheels of the carts sinking into the soft earth. The air grows colder with each passing day, hinting at the harsh winter to come. John, already unwell, finds his condition worsening with every jolt of his carriage. His face, once perhaps capable of a cruel sneer or a fleeting smile, now contorts in discomfort. He's a king on the run, his kingdom fracturing around him, and his body beginning to betray him. The journey takes him through Swineshead Abbey, where, according to some accounts, a fateful decision is made regarding his diet. This is where a quirky, almost tragically comedic tidbit enters the historical record. It is said that King John, perhaps seeking some comfort or simply indulging a craving, consumed a copious amount of peaches and drank deeply of new cider. Now, you might think, oh, a little fruit and a nice drink, what's the harm? Light joke one. But remember, this is the 13th century. Refrigeration is a distant dream. Hygiene is, let's just say, a work in progress, and new cider could mean anything from slightly fermented apple juice to something that would strip paint off a wall. For a man already under immense physical duress, this was, to put it mildly, a poor dietary choice. Whether it was the peaches, the cider, or simply the culmination of weeks of stress and campaigning, his illness intensifies dramatically. The prevailing belief, a mainstream historical fact, is that King John succumbed to dysentery. You can imagine the agonizing symptoms: the crippling stomach cramps, the relentless fever, the rapid dehydration that saps every ounce of strength. It's a truly miserable way to go, especially for a man who, despite his villainy, was still a king, accustomed to a certain level of comfort and medical attention, however rudimentary it might have been in those days. From Swineshead, he struggles onward to Sleaford Castle and then, finally, to Newark Castle. You can almost hear the sighs of relief from his dwindling retinue when they finally reach the relative safety of the castle walls. But it's a false sense of security. The king is clearly dying. You can picture the hushed whispers in the castle corridors, the frantic consultations among the few physicians and attendants who remain loyal. The air would have been thick with the smell of sickness, of herbal remedies, and perhaps the faint scent of fear. He is confined to his bed, racked with pain, his once powerful voice reduced to a hoarse whisper. His final days at Newark are a grim tableau. The once feared monarch, the man who defied the Pope and crushed his barons, lies helpless, his reign dissolving around him like sand through an hourglass. The civil war still rages outside the castle walls. Prince Louis and the rebellious barons are still very much a threat. The kingdom is a fractured mess, and the king who caused so much of that fracturing is now too weak to even lift his head. It's a bitter irony, isn't it? The man who craved absolute power is utterly powerless in his final moments. In these final hours, King John, surprisingly, attends to his affairs. He amends his will, a document that speaks volumes about his priorities, even at death's door. He entrusts his young son, Henry, to the care of loyal advisors, most notably William Marshall, the esteemed Earl of Pembroke, a man renowned for his integrity and military prowess. This act, perhaps his most sensible in years, highlights the desperate situation he leaves behind. A child king, a kingdom in turmoil, and a future entirely uncertain. Historians still argue whether this final will was a genuine act of paternal concern and a pragmatic attempt to secure his son's succession, or simply a last-ditch effort to salvage some semblance of control from beyond the grave. Was it a flicker of responsibility or just another calculated maneuver? The answer, like so much about John, remains shrouded in the murky depths of history. As the hours tick by on October 19, 1216, the king's breath grows shallow. The fever rages, his body wastes away. You might imagine the silence in the chamber, broken only by the raspy breathing of the dying king and the hushed prayers of those few who remain by his side. There are no grand farewells, no heroic last words. His end is not the glorious death of a warrior king on the battlefield, but the painful, ignominious passing of a sick man in a castle bed. It's a quiet, desolate end for a man whose life was anything but quiet. And then it happens. The final breath. King John, the most terrible king in medieval history, is no more. The exact time is recorded as midnight, October 19th, 1216. Imagine the immediate reactions. A mix of relief, fear, and uncertainty. Relief that the tyrant is gone. Fear of what comes next. Uncertainty because the war is far from over. It's like a house party where the host finally passes out, but the music keeps blaring, and everyone's still fighting over who gets the last slice of pizza. Light joke 2. His death doesn't immediately bring peace. It merely shifts the chess pieces on the board of chaos. The news spreads slowly, carried by weary riders through a war-torn land. For many, his death is met not with mourning, but with a profound sense of liberation. The man who had taxed them mercilessly, seized their lands, violated their rights, and brought their country to the brink of ruin, was finally gone. You can almost hear the collective sigh of relief ripple across the land. A quiet, almost imperceptible good riddance from the common folk and the disgruntled barons alike. Light joke 3. His body is prepared for burial. In a final, somewhat unusual twist, considering the royal tradition of Westminster Abbey, King John is laid to rest at Worcester Cathedral, in accordance with his wishes. His tomb lies before the altar, a resting place far removed from the grand mausoleum of his predecessors and successors. His legacy, even in death, is one of isolation and difference. So you leave King John, not in a blaze of glory, but in the quiet, agonizing moments of his bitter end. His reign concludes amidst the very chaos and rebellion he had fomented. He leaves behind not a golden age, but a kingdom fractured, a treasury empty, and a child on the throne. His final moments are a stark reflection of his life, a desperate struggle against forces he could not control, culminating in failure and a legacy steeped in tyranny. The stage is now set for the next act, but the shadow of King John, the most terrible king, will forever loom large over England's medieval tapestry. Section 16. Now, as the long, winding tale of King John finally draws to a close, you find yourself standing on the precipice of history, looking back at a reign that, even centuries later, manages to cast a truly formidable shadow. You've journeyed through the murk and the mire of his rule, felt the sting of his arbitrary justice, and even, perhaps, winced at the sheer audacity of his blunders. But what, you might wonder, is his lasting legacy? How does this monarch, so comprehensively, unpopular in his own time, continue to echo through the corridors of our collective memory? You see, for many, many years, pretty much since the ink was still drying on his various disastrous treaties and the whispers of his death were still fresh on people's lips, King John has held a rather unenviable title, England's worst king. It's like a historical gold medal, but for the opposite of achievement. When you think of medieval monarchs, you might conjure images of grand crusaders, wise lawgivers, or even charming rogues. But then there's John, standing awkwardly in the corner, holding a sign that just says, "I messed up a lot." He's the historical equivalent of that one friend who always forgets their wallet, but also accidentally sets fire to the restaurant. His infamy isn't just some dusty academic footnote. It's woven into the very fabric of English identity. You discover that his name, John, which was once a perfectly respectable and even regal name, fell dramatically out of favor for centuries following his reign. Imagine being so universally disliked that parents collectively decided, "Nope, not naming our kid that." This is quite the historical mic drop, wouldn't you agree? For generations, if you wanted to describe someone as truly awful, you didn't need elaborate adjectives. You just said, "He's a regular King John." It became shorthand for treachery, avarice, and general unpleasantness. Think about it. You've seen him as Prince John, the sneering, self-serving brother in countless tales of Robin Hood, forever plotting against the noble Richard. This portrayal, amplified and embellished over centuries, cemented his image in the popular imagination as the quintessential villain. He's not just a bad king in history books. He's the guy who tries to steal Maid Marian's inheritance, taxes the poor into oblivion, and probably kicks puppies when no one's looking. Though, to be fair, the puppy kicking is purely speculative, but it wouldn't surprise anyone, right? This cultural embedding is powerful. It means that even someone who's never opened a history textbook probably has a vague, negative impression of King John, thanks to Saturday morning cartoons and classic literature. His failures, you recall, weren't isolated incidents. They were a cascading waterfall of poor decisions, each one eroding a little more of his standing and a lot more of his kingdom's stability. You remember the chilling disappearance of Arthur of Brittany, a young nephew conveniently vanishing from the historical record. This act, whether direct murder or something equally nefarious, painted him as a man utterly devoid of familial affection or moral compass. It was a cold, calculated move for power, and it stuck to him like mud. Then came the catastrophic loss of the French Empire, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, the ancestral lands of the Plantagenets gone just like that. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was a profound humiliation, shrinking England's continental ambitions and branding John as Lackland once more. But this time for real, forever. It's like losing your car keys, but the car is an entire duchy and the keys are your entire army. And then, you recall, came the epic showdown with Pope Innocent III. Imagine picking a fight with the most powerful spiritual leader in Europe, a man who could literally shut down your entire country. John did, and he lost. Big time. The interdict, the excommunication, the eventual, utterly humiliating submission where he effectively made England a papal vassal state. It was a spiritual siege, and John's stubborn pride eventually crumbled, leaving a deep scar on the nation's psyche and a lingering sense of national shame. You can almost hear the collective groan of the English people as their king knelt before a papal legate, offering up their kingdom like a slightly used gift basket. But perhaps the most visceral reason for his enduring infamy, the one that truly bit into the lives of everyday people, was his tyranny of taxation. You remember the crushing levies, the inventive ways he found to squeeze every last penny from his subjects, from widows to knights. He taxed everything, it seemed, short of the air you breathed, and he probably would have, if he could have figured out how to meter it. This wasn't just about funding wars. It was about funding a lavish lifestyle, about maintaining a capricious power that recognized no bounds. It was this relentless financial pressure, this feeling of being constantly exploited, that finally united the barons against him. They weren't just annoyed. They were truly, deeply existentially fed up. This deep-seated resentment culminated, as you well know, at Runnymede, resulting in the revolutionary document known as Magna Carta. This charter, forced upon him by his exasperated barons, was a monumental step towards limiting royal power, a promise that even a king was subject to the law. It was a beacon of hope for a more just future. And then, in a move that perfectly encapsulates his character, John immediately, almost gleefully, repudiated it. It was like signing a peace treaty, shaking hands, and then immediately tripping the other guy as he walks away. This swift betrayal plunged England back into civil war, showing his utter contempt for agreements, for justice, and for his own people. It cemented his image as a man incapable of honor, a king whose word was utterly worthless. You then remember the chaos of the First Barons' War, the desperate invitation to French invasion, and the final, almost poetic blow, the loss of his royal treasury in the treacherous tides of the Washington. It was a dramatic, almost cinematic end to his earthly wealth, a final symbolic stripping away of his power and resources. He never recovered from that physically or mentally. It was as if fate itself had decided to deliver a final, resounding no to his reign. His death, in the midst of this turmoil, was not met with mourning but with a palpable sense of relief. You sensed the collective sigh of a nation exhausted by his reign, a nation desperate for stability. His legacy, therefore, is not one of great achievement or even tragic heroism. It is, instead, a stark warning. He stands as a perpetual reminder of what happens when power is wielded without responsibility, when a monarch views his kingdom as a personal piggy bank, and his subjects as mere instruments of his will. Historians still argue whether John was truly a uniquely evil man, or merely the product of a brutal age, exacerbated by a profound lack of political acumen and an unparalleled talent for alienating absolutely everyone. Was he a psychopath or just desperately insecure and incompetent? The truth, as always, is probably a complex tapestry of both. But what is undeniable is the historical judgment. He is consistently ranked at the very bottom of any list of English monarchs, a position he has held with remarkable consistency for over 800 years. That's a pretty solid track record for badness, you have to admit. It's like being the undisputed champion of the worst boss ever award year after year. His story is a cautionary tale whispered through the ages, of the dangers of unchecked power, of the vital importance of the rule of law, and of the profound impact a single individual's character can have on the destiny of a nation. You reflect on how, paradoxically, his very awfulness paved the way for something truly great. His tyranny was so unbearable that it forced the hand of the barons, leading to the Magna Carta, a document that, despite his immediate rejection, would eventually become a cornerstone of constitutional law, not just in England but across the world. So, in a strange, roundabout way, even in his failure, he inadvertently contributed to the foundations of modern liberty. He was the chaotic catalyst, the historical equivalent of needing a really bad cold to appreciate the simple joy of breathing through your nose. So, as you drift towards the edge of this historical journey, you leave King John not as a hero, nor even as a tragic figure, but as a perpetual shadow in the annals of English history. His name remains synonymous with deceit, cruelty, and monumental failure. He is the king you tell stories about when you want to warn someone about what not to do. He is the standard against which all other bad kings are measured. And in that, perhaps, lies his most enduring, albeit infamous, legacy. He is the terrible king, forever etched into the medieval tapestry, a stark and unforgettable figure. And now, as the echoes of King John's turbulent reign gently fade into the quiet night, you find yourself at the very end of our journey through his long and often difficult story. The stirring tales of treachery and triumph, of grand castles and whispered rebellions, are now settling, like dust motes dancing in the last rays of twilight. Your mind, perhaps a little weary from the weight of history, can now begin its slow, peaceful descent into slumber. All the kings and queens, the knights and the peasants, the grand pronouncements and the quiet struggles, they are now safely tucked away, resting in the soft folds of time, much like a well-loved book placed carefully back upon a shelf. There is nothing more to worry about, no more battles to fight, no more charters to sign or betray. The historical currents have run their course for tonight, leaving behind only a tranquil calm. Just the gentle hum of the night, holding you close in its soft embrace. Let the lingering images of ancient forests and distant battlefields dissolve, transforming into the soft, comforting landscapes of your dreams. Picture a quiet meadow, perhaps, or a gentle stream flowing under a moonlit sky. Breathe in slowly, deeply, letting go of all the day's thoughts, releasing any lingering tensions, and embracing the stillness that gathers around you like a warm, soft blanket. You are safe, you are warm, and the vast, fascinating world of history will patiently await your return. Another night, another time. For now, with the stories concluded and the day's adventures gently receding, it is truly time to rest. Let your eyelids grow heavy, your breath deepen, and your thoughts become as light as feathers, floating away into the vast, peaceful expanse of sleep.